Unlike the first hall, which contained information on all sorts of different topics, this one seemed to delve much deeper into a single one. A rather important subject for the Amenthei too. Their world's history. Rather than different categories, the columns along the room's perimeter covered the entire chronology of Amenthès, each jumping ahead by a certain increment of time. 375,000 BC, 370,000 BC, 365,000 BC. Percy was tempted to just skip this room entirely and climb up to the next one. He had already cut his most important alchemy lesson short out of necessity. So why would he waste his time reading about the history of some civilization he hadn't even heard of until a few hours ago? But he didn't do that. Even if he sprinted to the top of the pyramid, there was no guarantee he'd find an exit there. This wasn't even the physical world, so expecting to find a regular door leading out of a dream, or whatever this was, wasn't the smartest idea. I should at least try to understand what exactly happened to these people, and how they ended up here. Obviously, reading everything wasn't realistic, so he'd have to be smart about it. His best bet would be to try and pinpoint the most important events that had led to the creation of this sanctuary. Looking for the oldest date in the hall, Percy soon approached the column with the 432,117 BC heading. It was both the largest number and the only one that wasn't round. Placing his hand on it, he then skimmed through random sections around the hall, trying to get a sense of how these people had started out. While this is the earliest recorded date in our history, our scholars believe that our ancestors have been around for a while longer. Traces of eroded tools and destroyed structures suggest that our people first showed signs of true intelligence as early as 780000 BC. The loss of our beast affinities was initially detrimental, placing our ancestors at a severe disadvantage against the monsters surrounding their villages. The variety of new affinities they manifested, coupled with their intelligence and use of tools, made up for that to an extent, but it was still a difficult time for our people. Percy frowned. The Amenthei had clearly started out no differently than most other civilizations did, which shouldn't matter much to his current predicament. Walking to the corresponding section of the next wall, he skipped ahead to 330,000 BC, hoping these people had invented elixirs by then. Holding back the Rafhenites was almost impossible, as a single blue specimen could decimate an entire village by itself. At their peak, half a dozen blue Rafhenites had been reported roaming the continent, slaughtering everything in their path. Our people had been forced to live as nomads, hiding from the monsters. Many of them followed greenborn leaders who had advanced to blue themselves. Sadly, the amber potions had still been flawed at the time, so nobody had reached violet yet. Not yet. They had alchemy, but not enough for fast advancements. Percy yawned before changing to the next section. This time he didn't jump ahead too far, knowing he was close to the invention of true elixirs. 325,000 BC. That was when Caliphon the Wise realized we could still improve upon our potions. Working alongside his colleagues, he spent years trying out different things, though it wasn't until a long time later that his successors completed his work. 320,000 BC finally allowed us to conquer Amenthès and establish our first true cities, some of which have stood the test of time to this day. Since then, the year 319,547 BC has been widely considered to be the dawn of our civilization, marking the beginning of our golden age. Stolen from its rightful place, this narrative is not meant to be on Amazon. Report any sightings. Reading this felt a little strange to Percy. Obviously, these years hadn't been called that at the time. Nobody in their right mind would pick a random 6-digit number and start counting backward from there. Clearly, their historians had later gone back and altered all these dates to place them in reference to some other big event. Yet, Percy struggled to imagine what could possibly be more important than the dawn of their civilization, or the invention of elixirs. Regardless, he was happy he was getting somewhere. Percy started skipping ahead by increments of 20,000 years at a time, looking for anything else of interest. At first, there wasn't much. The subsequent sections mostly talked about various countries and wars fought between them, as well as the discovery of many of the arts and fields of research he had already seen mentioned in the previous library. Free from their wild oppressors, the Amenthei had finally managed to conquer their planet and elevate themselves. It wasn't until 6 sections later that something caught his eye again. 200,000 BC. The potion makers thought this was a promising new avenue to pursue, though they had to ask the Daughter of Heaven for her permission and funding to embark on that quest. Daughter of Heaven? Who's that? She sounded like an important figure, though Percy had missed the details surrounding her rise to power. Backtracking by a couple of columns, it didn't take him long to find the answer. 210,000 BC. And thus, she obtained a power that far surpassed that of any king or queen before her. Her beauty made the stars in the night sky look like pieces of coal, and she held in her hands the strength to shatter mountains and dry up lakes. In the year 208,989 BC, she single-handedly ended all wars, and finally united the people of Amenthei under her command. As far as Percy could tell, this woman was a goddess, this world's first one. In fact, most curiously, the text had never used that word to describe her though, nor did it ever mention her real name. A cursory scan of the next few sections confirmed that they had always referred to her as the Daughter of Heaven. It was almost as if these people didn't even understand what godhood was, that it was just another step on the path of magic. They treated her more like a symbol, a chosen one who had descended upon their world to save and rule them. Sure enough, Percy failed to find any mention of other gods in the following sections. Apparently, this woman was the only goddess Amenthei had ever produced. In fact, she had to be the one whose soul he had seen when he approached the sanctuary. She was probably inside the pyramid right now. 200,000 years is quite young for a goddess though. It was a long time for mortals, as even a greenborn who had made it all the way past white would probably not live nearly that long. But it wasn't that much compared to the deities they had on Remir. If he wasn't mistaken, Phoebe should be over 1 million years old, and most of the active gods in the divine order should be at least half that. Percy had no idea when the first gods had risen on Remir, nor did he know when humanity had first evolved into a sapient species, but he guessed it should have been a couple million years ago at the very least. Granted, he didn't know how long a year on Amenthei was either, but if it was in the same ballpark as years on Remir, this woman would barely be considered a child among deities. And so were the Amenthei as a whole, compared to other civilizations he had encountered. It wasn't just their young age that stood out, but also their planet's smaller size. Felmara wasn't a large world either, but even they had produced multiple gods. Not nearly as many as Remir, and they didn't have a single titan either, but Raziel wasn't the only one. Just the most recent holder of the Proudheart name. In other words, he was merely the strongest one still around. Okay, then, so, it's a young world with a young goddess. Possibly didn't know as much about the rest of the cosmos either, depending on how far the nearest civilization was. Either way, Percy had yet to learn what had forced the Amenthei into this pyramid. Was it even located on their original world? Or had they fled Amenthei entirely? Perhaps this was some kind of spaceship as much as it was a sanctuary? What if the goddess had placed her people in deep slumber and taken as many of them as she could with her, to protect them from some calamity? Shrugging, Percy continued skipping ahead by large increments, inching closer and closer to the present moment. Skimming through section after section, he still found no mention of a disaster. This entire room seemed to describe nothing more than the golden age of Amenthei, listing the achievements of the goddess as she led her people to prosperity. It wasn't until Percy reached the 5000 BC column, right before the 432,117 BC column he had started with, that he realized this room didn't even reach the present. Actually, didn't the text in Razif's room say he had lived in the 13,000s or something? And I think it was AC, not BC. The dates there had clearly moved forward, not backward, meaning that something major should have happened in the year 0. Percy felt a shiver roll down his spine, the shock even jolting him out of his drowsiness for a couple seconds. Turning to look at the stairs leading out of the room, he guessed they would take him to a third hall. It was just speculation on his end, but he had a hunch that place would hold the answers to many of his remaining questions. Rushing to the third floor, Percy couldn't help but lament the monotonous environment of the pyramid. It would have been a lot easier to keep myself awake if I didn't have to stare at the same red stone all the time. Sighing, he examined the walls along the perimeter of the hall, soon confirming it was another library like the ones before. Sure enough, it seemed to follow the time period directly after that of the second level, though he had yet to learn what the event was that had transformed the very way in which the Amenthei had kept track of time. Searching for the first column in chronological order, Percy wondered why the architects of the pyramid hadn't just placed it right by the entrance. It seemed like the structure had been put together rather hastily, the ones responsible not having the time nor the mental capacity to spare on matters of practicality. It was probably for the same reason that one had to traverse dozens of corridors just to descend to the bottom of the pyramid, where a single staircase could have sufficed. It was almost like all the connections between the various rooms had been installed as an afterthought, with no expectation that somebody would have to use them one day. In any case, Percy soon found the column he was looking for, though its heading was a little strange. Rather than a numerical age, it was titled Emergence of the First Cloud. At first, he had to do a double-take, unsure if this was truly the section corresponding to the year 0. But it was sandwiched between the sections 13, 327 AC, and 200 AC, so it had to be it. So, this period is much shorter than their golden age. The sections only jump by 200 years each time too, rather than 5,000. Obviously, that didn't necessarily mean that the year 13,327 AC was the present. Unless the pyramid possessed some magical enchantment that updated the entries in real time, it could have been thousands or even millions of years since the most recent section. Then again, Percy was confident that wasn't the case. The mortal souls sleeping inside the sanctuary were degrading relatively quickly, so he guessed it couldn't have been more than a few centuries since they were placed here. Sure, the goddess might have found a way to preserve them as long as possible, but there was still a limit to how long a soul could survive without a proper body, even when shoved inside some functional alternative and forced into deep sleep. Shrugging, he placed his hand on the entry, causing the text on the ceiling and floor to shift. A well-known saying among the Amenthei since time immemorial is that treasures are paid for by blood, sweat, or tears, never handed away for free. Perhaps, then, we should have known that our hundreds of thousands of years of prosperity would have come at a price. And what a steep one it was. It was a day like any other, when the first of the dark clouds emerged over the city of Najubta. Its inhabitants didn't realize what it meant, thinking it was just a rain cloud, like any other, and they weren't entirely wrong about that. They rejoiced as the cloud shielded them from the scorching sunlight, and once the first droplets washed the ground. But it didn't take them long to realize the black liquid pouring down wasn't water at all. The next few paragraphs just talked about the first weeks and months of the black rain, while the Amenthei still struggled to wrap their heads around the strange phenomenon. Percy naturally skipped ahead in search of answers. The insects were the first to fall asleep about a decade later. Not all of them either. Our people didn't immediately draw the connection, since it had been so long since the rain started, and there hadn't been any other adverse effects. At the time, they naively assumed it was some unrelated disease that had befallen the pests. By the end of the century, no brown creature was left alive, every last one having long been crushed or devoured in its sleep. All the species relying on them for sustenance started going extinct one after the other, as an unprecedented famine overcame Amenthei. Percy had to skip a few columns again, as the onset of the disaster had been quite gradual. People had argued over food, but things had still remained fairly calm for decades, since their goddess had kept the peace, and they had found many ways to deal with the famine. This story has been unlawfully obtained without the author's consent. Report any appearances on Amazon. Not every species had gone extinct, so the people had been able to adapt, mainly by cultivating crops and cattle that weren't as reliant on the insects for survival. It hadn't taken long for the natives to get used to the changes and return to some level of normalcy. Yet, that hadn't been the end of the disaster. In hindsight, it could be argued that it had barely begun. 800 AC. Throughout this time, the clouds never disappeared. If anything, they only grew more numerous, their dark rain continuing to curse our lands as the filthy liquid formed rivers and lakes, spreading its infernal influence over Amenthei. The daughter tried to destroy them, of course, but nothing she did worked. When she forcefully dispersed the clouds, more of them formed elsewhere. When she removed the liquid from the surface of our world, regular lakes darkened instead, their water being replaced by the filth. It seemed that even the emissary of the heavens was powerless to stop what was to come. At some point, our people started to fall asleep too. It was easy to wake them up at first. A gentle whisper in their ears was enough for a while. But it wasn't long before it took a painful slap on their cheeks, or a bucketful of water. Eventually, that didn't work either. Percy's knees suddenly gave out. He barely caught himself by leaning against the wall. He was still interested in this section, but he moved on anyway, knowing he was running out of time. 3400 AC. The curse didn't have anything to do with one's age or grade. It appeared capable of infecting anyone at random. It only affected a small fraction of our population at first, but their numbers kept climbing at a frightening rate. Our potion makers worked tirelessly in search of a cure, or multiple cures, really each more potent than the last. Eventually, no mundane means could wake the infected, so we had to resort to magic to save them. Once more, our efforts had succeeded, but we had seen enough by that point to tell we had merely bought ourselves more time. Percy's vision began to blur as he neared his limit. If it hadn't been for his frightened heart racing at 100 miles an hour because of what he was reading, he would have probably fallen asleep too. As things stood, he was fully cognizant of the fact that succumbing to the slumber would spell his doom. Not having any other choice, he walked to the opposite side of the room, skipping a full 7,000 years at once. 600 AC. Differentiating regular sleep from that induced by the curse was all but impossible, so we lived in constant fear. Every night many slept, and every morning fewer woke up. All the intricate remedies we invented fell short one after the other, as our population declined. Some resisted the disease a little better, for reasons we never quite managed to piece together. But that didn't mean much. Percy practically stumbled around the room, switching to one column after another. He mostly did this to keep himself awake, jumping to another section whenever his eyes drooped. At this point, he wasn't even hoping for a coherent picture of the events. He just wanted an answer to what this place was. 400 AC. The sky was pitch black already, the hellish clouds plunging our world into darkness. Most of the surface was covered by a dark ocean, forcing the last survivors to flee to the tallest peaks. If that hadn't been enough, insidious shapes crawled out of the abyss, invading our homes and dragging the ones still awake back into the cold depths of the hellish sea. 12,000 AC. Barely any of us left. We fought to hold the monsters back. They weren't people, nor were they beasts. We didn't even know what they were, nor did we care. We just killed however many we managed, trying to buy the daughter a little more time. 400 AC. The daughter spent most of her time immersed in the dark waters, fighting against the monsters. She slaughtered them by the thousands, yet nobody could tell if that even helped. Struggling to remain upright, Percy made his way to the final column. He had yet to find the answer he was looking for, but he couldn't stand around reading this stuff either. He'd only fall asleep faster that way. Whether or not he learned how this sanctuary had come about in the next couple of minutes, he'd have to leave this hall and make his way to the apex of the pyramid. If I don't find an exit there either, I'll have to self-destruct. As scared as he was of losing his life and even failing to bring the new alchemic principle back to Remier, it was better than losing one of his new chords over nothing. As luck would have it, however, the final section did offer a couple of answers. Most notably, it was a lot shorter than the ones before, barely covering a fraction of the ceiling, the text not even spreading to the floor at all. Furthermore, it was written in a vastly different tone from the previous entries. 327 AC. I don't know if anybody will ever read this, but this is my last shot at preserving our legacy for a little longer. I am the one the Amenthei have called the Daughter of the Heavens. I used to find pride in that title, and in all the things I have accomplished for our world, but these days I only feel shame at my failures. Most recently, I have come to appreciate my original name, the one that my mother gave me all those years ago. On the off chance that somebody thinks of me in the future, I implore them to remember me as Nephthys." Percy drew a sharp breath, his shock at the goddess's message buying him a few more minutes of sobriety. Not wasting any time, he dove into the text again, praying to all the gods present and absent for the information he needed to escape this death trap. When the calamity first struck, I instructed our historians and our scholars to compile a library of sorts to preserve the most valuable aspects of our culture in the event of our complete annihilation. You see, the situation wasn't nearly as dire back then, but the disaster had already caused several species to go extinct, and it had even rendered some parts of our world wholly inaccessible, at least to the others. Furthermore, our time was spent searching for solutions, so our people no longer had the time or the energy to pursue the fine arts, nor to further develop our culture. In hindsight, it seems my decision to collect and maintain this information had been the right one, despite how much I wish that wasn't the case. Since I am the last of the Amenthei still awake, I suppose the responsibility of writing this final entry now rests on my shoulders. I'll move a copy of this library inside my sanctuary too, along with the minds of my surviving subjects. I have no idea if I'll be able to last longer than the physical version of the text, but I've resolved myself to survive as long as I can. I doubt it will make the slightest difference to our fates, but I owe it to the countless people who have placed their hopes in me to at least try. Suffice to say, Percy could feel Nephthys' sorrow and desperation seeping through every word on the ceiling. And honestly, he shared those feelings since he found himself in pretty much the same situation. After all, he had already reached the end of the library and he still had no idea how this place worked. Based on the text, it seemed he had correctly guessed this wasn't a physical place, but rather something that existed in the deity's body, or more specifically, her mind. But that still didn't explain how he had found himself stuck, nor how he could escape. Out of options, he sprinted out of the room, tracing his previous steps. Sadly, the third hall only had a single entrance and no exit, which meant he couldn't possibly reach the top of the pyramid this way. He would inevitably have to pass through the previous halls and all the corridors again, much to his dismay. Well, I can't really blame her for not thinking things through. She clearly had much on her mind while creating this pyramid. At least, Percy found it a little easier to stay awake as he ran through the structure. The curse that had destroyed Amenthei had obviously grown extremely powerful over the centuries, to the point that no mortal had managed to escape its harrowing grasp. If it hadn't been for his spectral trait, he doubted he'd have lasted this long. Even with it, he'd only had a couple of hours, whereas some of these people had endured it for countless years. If I'm lucky, Nephthys can still be reasoned with. If I can't find a way out by myself, I can try asking her for help. Obviously, it would be a gamble, as he had no idea what her personality was like, nor what state she was in. But given his current circumstances, this wasn't necessarily worse than the alternative. Besides, maybe they could work together to come up with a solution. Between Metatron's decree and his bloodline, things might not be entirely hopeless. Sprinting through the narrow corridors, Percy's mind wandered back to everything he had learned today. Despite the pressure he had been under, he was glad he'd had the chance to study the complete history of a lesser spring, even if he'd been forced to do that rather hastily. It had allowed him to confirm a lot of the things he had suspected about the way barren worlds evolved into lesser springs. First, some sapients would emerge, losing their beast affinities in exchange for true intelligence and other mana types, much like Mrs. Liah had explained on Felmara. Then, they would have to hold their ground against the onslaught of beasts, just like Souls people had been doing on Melodia. If they got lucky, somebody would figure out a means of advancement, much like the dying hero had on Huehue. Eventually, some gods would appear, though they would probably be relatively clueless about cosmic matters at first. At least until more of them emerged, and they managed to leave their world and gather some information about the state of the universe. Amenthei had clearly not made it that far, while places like Remir, Huehue, and Felmara had. Even with elixirs, it wasn't easy for Greenborns to attain godhood, so that step wasn't immediate either. Unauthorized usage. This narrative is on Amazon without the author's consent. Report any sightings. Thinking of something, Percy couldn't help but crease his brow. That still doesn't fully explain where those clouds came from. At the start, he had assumed some other faction had attacked Amynthas. However, nothing he had read today had hinted at foul play. The clouds seemed to have been the product of some natural phenomenon, or rather, a quite unnatural one. Considering everything he knew about the universe, Percy's mind wandered back to one of his previous clones. This whole thing reminds me of those black vines that ruined Takeo's home. Was that what this was? Another demonic infestation? The way it encroached upon one's mind, forcing them into eternal slumber, it was simultaneously completely different, but also eerily similar to what the infernal jungle had done to the people of Toroi village. It had robbed them of their mana and their willingness to fight, plunging them into despair. It had drunk their blood and consumed their flesh until nothing remained. The more he thought about it, the more convinced Percy was that he was right. Over the years, he had subconsciously shoved his fear of demonic infestations aside. Part of it was due to the fact that he hadn't encountered a second one in a long time, making him assume they were quite rare. More importantly, he had always believed that infestations were things for weaker, less developed worlds to worry about. Takeo's people had likely lacked the means to advance even before the appearance of the jungle, and the insidious vines had robbed them of their ability to use magic entirely. It was no wonder, then, that they had been entirely powerless against the calamity. But a lesser spring like Remir wouldn't have to worry about that, right? They had several gods, so it should be trivial for the divine order to deal with an infestation, should one pop up. Or so he had thought. Evidently not. Percy swallowed hard. Perhaps he had been naive about this. The fall of Amynthas was proof that no place in the universe was truly safe. Even a goddess had failed to protect her world from the corruption. Sure, this place was a lot weaker than Remir, and Remir itself couldn't compare with the Peak factions. If an infestation dreadful enough to kill one god existed, who was to say an even more frightening one couldn't come to be? Though, there's a silver lining. At least, he was no longer worried about taking the disease back to his main body. While he wasn't an expert on demonic infestations, he was clear about one thing. It was common knowledge that they infected worlds, not individuals. Based on everything he'd read, Percy was confident the Amenthei would have woken up if they'd simply escaped from their dying planet. I wonder why Nephthys didn't even try to grab her people and leave. Percy hurried his steps even more, his heart racing like crazy. Outside of his own survival and the new principle he wanted to bring back to his main body, he had suddenly found himself worrying about something even more important. I need to bring this information home. I want the original to be aware of it. Of course, he didn't doubt that Phoebe and the other gods knew about this already. It wouldn't be Percy's job to defend Remir from threats like this for a very long time. Still, as somebody who frequently roamed the cosmos, he was sure this wasn't the last time he would stumble upon a situation like this. So immersed was he in his thoughts that he hadn't kept count of the corridors. If it wasn't for Razif's empty room whizzing by his side, Percy might have not even realized he'd already returned to his starting point. But he didn't stop there, knowing time wasn't on his side. Climbing one floor after the other, he reached the end of the greens, and then the blues before spotting the violets. There weren't nearly as many people at the higher grades, so he had to be close to whatever came next. Either way, the violets were sleeping soundly on their beds, their rooms pretty much identical to those of their subordinates. If he didn't have soul vision, he wouldn't have been able to tell them apart at all. A wave of weakness suddenly overcame him, as his thoughts slowed down to a crawl. Percy found himself stumbling frequently or crashing on the walls, struggling to run in a straight line. He'd already exhausted pretty much every mental exercise he could think of, yet there was no holding the infestation back any longer. He was halfway up what he hoped was the final set of stairs to the top, the last corridor having barely been a few meters across, when he finally lost his footing, tumbling down the steps. The fall itself didn't hurt that much, but he quickly found himself unable to get up again. Let alone standing, Percy had to lean on the wall to even sit up, his surroundings spinning around him as his head felt heavy. Smiling bitterly, he pulled some mana from his stash, shaping it into a handful of knives. Pointing them at Razif's neck, where his own wisp had taken root. He intended to shred his soul to pieces. Well, this sucks. At least I won't feel a thing. He really wished he could have made it back, yet it appeared it wasn't meant to be. There wasn't much room for hesitation either. Unless he destroyed himself in the next couple of seconds, he might never get another chance. Gritting his teeth, he was about to launch the constructs, when he felt a gentle grip squeeze his shoulder, stopping him in his tracks. A warm feeling spread through Percy's body, soothing his mind and relieving him of his exhaustion. Please forgive me for not helping you out earlier. I have selfishly indulged in my curiosity. Given the things you have learned about us, I hope you won't hold it against me. A female voice said. It was crisp and clear, bouncing against the crimson walls as its echo trailed through the corridors. It seemed like every inch of the pyramid resonated with the sound, welcoming it home. Turning to look at the tall woman standing beside him, Percy scanned her slender body from head to toe, making note of her flawless skin and elegant clothes. Unlike the bare-bones attire of her subjects, she wore a long flowing dress that reached all the way to an inch above her sandals. A thin, winding crown adorned her forehead as a translucent veil fell over her features. Nephthys, I presume? He asked, getting a curt nod back. Perhaps he should have acted less casual toward the alien goddess, as he had no way to tell how friendly she was. In his defense, she had just saved his life, however. On top of that, she radiated a gentle presence, far less domineering or suffocating than Metatron's or Raziel's. Instinctively, he gathered some fused mana to his eyes, peering into her body. He almost squinted, having expected to be blinded by her divine radiance. To his surprise, he saw nothing in there though, her current body appearing to be little more than an empty vessel. You won't find it in here, she chuckled. Think bigger, she added, gesturing at their surroundings. So, we're truly inside your mind then? He asked, still finding that difficult to believe, despite all the clues pointing toward that conclusion. The woman shook her head, however. Not exactly. Even with my mind affinity, I don't think I'm quite capable of pulling another's mind into my own. Oh, but make no mistake, this world is, in fact, inside my body. Just not where you have imagined it to be. Percy frowned, thinking back to what he knew about gods, which was admittedly very little, though there were a couple of things he had read about them while growing up, one of which he thought might apply here. Your internal world? Nephthys was the one to raise an eyebrow this time, having probably not expected him to guess accurately. I never quite gave this ability a name, since there wasn't much of a point. After all, I was the only person on Amenthess to reach my current level. But yes, that sounds like a suitable descriptor. Percy nodded. He didn't really know much about internal worlds, other than the fact that only gods had them. Apparently, it was what became of their domains once they attained divinity. Or wait, was he remembering this incorrectly? Was it what their mana cores turned into? Was that why he hadn't seen a core in Metatron's body? It's actually both, Nephthys smiled, startling him. If you ever make it this far, your core and your domain will merge, giving rise to this internal world, as you call it. Percy wasn't in the mood to discuss divine magic, however, focusing on something more serious. You can read my thoughts? He asked, furrowing his brow. Only in here. Once again, I must ask for your forgiveness at my lack of discretion. But you are the one who's barged in here uninvited. The revelation shook Percy to his core, but he had to admit she was right. He'd invaded her most private place, albeit unknowingly, so he didn't have any room to complain that his thoughts had leaked. When did you notice me? As soon as you stepped foot in the pyramid. Find this and other great novels on the author's preferred platform. Support original creators. Then, why didn't you show up earlier? Nephthys shrugged. Like I said, I was curious. I wanted to see your genuine reaction upon exploring this place and learning about Amenthess, and to possibly figure out how somebody at such a low grade had even managed to get here. No offense. And have you satisfied your curiosity? Very much so. Gods and mortals, lesser springs. Demonic infestations. I was genuinely humbled by the wealth of information you have unwittingly shared. It would appear Amynthess was both extremely lucky to have made it as far as we have, and exceptionally unlucky to have encountered such a horrific calamity so early. The goddess sighed. I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I had been more proactive. Could I have pushed others to attain divinity faster? Could I have worked harder to become one of those titans you've thought of? Would it have even made a difference? But I suppose it no longer matters. What's done is done. I won't keep you here any longer. Percy suddenly felt his connection to his main body return, causing his eyes to widen. It was you. You were the one preventing me from leaving. Nephthys gave him an apologetic smile before speaking. It wasn't my intention to harm or frighten you. I just never imagined I would ever get a chance to meet another person in my life, so I didn't want you to go too quickly. I assure you, you were never in any danger. Percy frowned, contemplating the goddess's words. She didn't seem to be lying, though he couldn't help but feel apprehensive toward her. After all, she was not only a goddess but one with the mind affinity. There was no telling what she was even capable of. Then again, he couldn't even hide his thoughts from her, so his apprehension was worthless. How did you banish my lethargy anyway? I don't suppose that will last very long. It will not. Even with that spectral trait of yours, I doubt it will keep you awake for more than a couple hours. It will be even less effective the second time I try it. The slumber is great at adapting to all of our countermeasures. The only thing that seems to work for an extended period of time is attaining divinity, which is not something anyone can accomplish. If not for this, my people wouldn't have been reduced to such a sorry state. Percy nodded, deciding to just go with the flow. If Nephthys wanted to harm him, there was nothing he could do to stop her anyway. Rather than worrying about the things he couldn't affect, he figured he might as well look for a way to help these people. I appreciate the sentiment, but I don't think that portal of yours will help, she replied, not even waiting for him to voice his question. My physical body has already succumbed to the slumber. I've barely been able to preserve a sliver of my consciousness in here. I don't think I can even twitch my fingers, and if I was to abandon my body entirely, my soul, my mind, and my internal world would fall apart rather quickly. Why didn't you escape with your people while you were still awake? Percy asked. How would I have done that? I don't know. You're the goddess here. Percy shrugged. I was under the impression that gods can traverse the cosmos, but I have no idea how it works. Nephthys appeared to ponder his question for a few seconds. If this is truly an ability that all deities share, it is unfortunately one that I have never mastered, though it might simply not be compatible with my mind affinity. Percy remained silent for a while, thinking about a great many things. He could ask Zoras about internal worlds and the method gods used to travel from planet to planet, but it would be too late to help Nephthys by then. Granted, the goddess hadn't even asked him to help, probably guessing this was a problem well outside a mortal's capabilities. And she might be right about that. Still, he didn't feel good about escaping by himself and abandoning these people to their grim fates. So, have you read all of my memories? He suddenly asked. Are you sure there's nothing we can do? The goddess shook her head. I can't read your memories. Only what's at the forefront of your mind. Why? Do you have any other ideas? Some hope flashed in Percy's eyes, but he pressed it down, not wanting to get the goddess excited over nothing. During the next few minutes, he went over everything he could think of, telling the goddess about souls, about the universe, and about his bloodline, just in case it gave her some well-needed inspiration. This is fascinating stuff, though most of it isn't applicable here, I don't think, except for that bloodline of yours. That thing you did years ago, turning your friend into a familiar. Do you think you can do it again? Percy tilted his head in confusion. Sure, he'd shared everything about his bloodline with Nephthys, in case it gave her an idea, but he didn't think that aspect of it would work in this situation. I'm confident I can do it again. And, in fact, I was planning to do exactly that in the next few years, but I think that would only work with my hosts. I can try bringing Rays of Soul back if it's not too far gone, yet I seriously doubt I can help anyone else. Why not? Nephthys asked. Well, my bloodline only allows me to possess a single soul at a time. After it's used up, I can't exactly change hosts unless I return to my body first. Razif is the one I've possessed, not you, or any of the others. Nephthys leaned back on the wall, sliding down to sit next to Percy. He was a little surprised to see her acting so casual with him. Had it been Metatron or Raziel, they would have probably found the very notion of mingling with a mortal like this quite insulting. It only made him feel worse about this whole mess, however. Why did the good goddess have to watch as her entire world got destroyed, while the bastard deities got to plunder and pillage anyone they wanted with no consequences? Maybe there's some hope after all, Nephthys exclaimed at some point, breaking him out of his thoughts. Percy flashed her a questioning look, prompting her to continue. If I've understood this correctly, you activated your bloodline twice the last time you created a familiar. The first time had been to possess your friend in his original world, and to subsequently bring his soul back to your own. The second instance had occurred when you placed him in the egg. Percy nodded along, realizing where she was going with this. I suppose only the second instance is actually important. As long as we can somehow get you back to my world, it won't matter that I haven't possessed you yet. My body will be there to activate the bloodline again when it's time to place you in a new body. Correct. The goddess smiled, before continuing. Right now, I just need to hitch a ride with Razif. Since he and his soul are currently residing within my internal world, it won't be too difficult to anchor myself to you during the return trip. Percy frowned, thinking of a potential problem. I don't know. That might work, but I don't think I can carry you back. Last time, I struggled a lot to bring even a fragment of a yellow soul back. It had felt extremely heavy, and it nearly tore me apart, even after discarding most of Mickey's soul. He lost all his memories in the process, and he has yet to recover. Despite all the progress I've made over the years, I'm not confident I could bring even a violet's soul back, let alone a god's. Sure, his higher grade and his blessing would help, but the gap between mortals and deities was simply too vast to bridge. Not to mention that Nephthys was probably not just thinking about herself. She clearly wanted to bring her entire sanctuary along, filled with hundreds of other souls. I believe I can help with that part, she said, causing him to raise an eyebrow. I might not have a soul affinity, but once a mage reaches my level, they gain some awareness of their mind and soul. I can't survive without a body like you, and I certainly can't split my soul into multiple functioning pieces or possess others, but I'm not entirely powerless. Meaning, well, I can selectively discard chunks of my soul and compress others, to forcefully shrink it down to the level of a mortal. I can do the same for my subjects. It will leave us all severely crippled, but we might be able to recover later, after you give us a new body. I think I can resist my world's pull too, to make my soul easier for you to carry. You sure you want to risk all of that though? If we fail, that's the end for you and your sanctuary. I make no promises that any of this will work. I don't expect you to. Nephthys shrugged. As things stand, we are doomed anyway. We can probably last for a few more centuries like this, but this isn't much of a life. I doubt another person willing and able to help us will show up anytime soon. It's pretty much this or nothing. Percy nodded grimly, practically feeling the goddess's presence brimming with determination. Even if this works, you understand you and your people will be stuck in the same body. Crappy one too. It'll be the mortal body of a beast, and not a high-grade one either. I have no idea if it's even possible to separate you. I understand the risks, and also how much of an inconvenience this may be for you. I won't insist that you do this for us, but know that the people of Amynthas will be eternally grateful to you if you choose to try, whether you succeed or not. Percy waved her concerns away, however. Like I said, I was planning to create another familiar in the near future anyway, so this won't change much for me. At most, I might have to expedite my plans a little. Say, do you have any preference as to what type of beast you want to be placed in? This tale has been unlawfully obtained from Novelbin. If you discover it on Amazon, kindly report it. Over the next few minutes, Percy gave her an overview of the animals they had on Remir. Last time, He hadn't had the luxury of choice, but Nephthys appeared confident that she could keep her soul from crumbling for a couple of years. That should give him plenty of time to search for a suitable host for the Amenthei. Of course, he had originally wanted to create a wasp familiar, and he had even been prepared to spend decades working toward that goal if necessary. However, he wasn't going to selfishly force these people into the body of an insect against their wishes. They'd suffered enough already. Actually, I don't think that's a bad choice, Nephthys said, much to his surprise. Are you sure? It sounds like these starry wasps have it the best out of every beast on your world. If we end up targeted by your gods at some point, it might serve us well to possess such a valuable body. It will give us the option of negotiating with them for the right to remain. Percy nodded. I don't know if I can get my hands on the egg in the next 2 years, though. If I fail, I'll be forced to put you inside a different body. Also, remember that I'm a mortal and a wanted criminal at that. This is a disclaimer I wouldn't typically bring up to a prospective familiar. But since you are a goddess and everything, please be aware that you're signing up for a huge downgrade. Nephthys tilted her head in confusion. Reading your thoughts earlier, I was under the impression you were aiming to become a god yourself. Is that untrue? Percy shrugged. It's not, and I want to tell myself I'll get there one day. But you know better than me how hard it is. So think long and hard about whether you want to place your hopes on me. I don't even know how many greenborns on Amynthess have failed to follow in your footsteps, let alone a redborn. Even if I manage to give you a body, there's no guarantee you'll live longer than you would have if I just left you here. The goddess sighed. I've mentioned this already, didn't I? What my people currently have isn't a life. In fact, it can barely even be called survival. If you're offering us a chance at something better, we would be fools to turn you down. Ah, but I might have a way to help you a little with your ambitions. Jumping to her feet, Nephthys ran up the stairs, gesturing for him to follow. Percy stood up too, rushing behind her, though he couldn't help but wonder why she couldn't just teleport them around the pyramid. Reading his thoughts, she chuckled. I can, but it feels nice to walk around for a change, even if I know it's fake. Shrugging, he remained quiet as they exited the corridor at the top of the structure, entering a hall similar to the ones at the base of the sanctuary, albeit much smaller. Nephthys didn't pause, however, taking a few stairs to another hall right below the first one, and then a third after that. Percy frowned, scanning the walls in passing. He was trying to figure out why this set of libraries hadn't been connected to the ones below, forcing him to go all the way around the pyramid to reach them. Family, hometown, early life, friends, age 0 to 1000. Friends, age 1001 to 3000. Friends, age 3001 to 8000. Are these my own memories? She smiled, though her expression appeared a little melancholic this time. Once you've lived as long as I have, you might find that your loved ones can't accompany you forever. As a goddess with a mind affinity, I was generally good at recalling even the most obscure details of my past. Sadly, the slumber hasn't made things easy for me. I ended up writing some of it down before secluding myself in here, to keep it close to my heart. Hearing that, Percy retracted his gaze, not wanting to snoop any more than he already had. This only caused Nephthys to chuckle again. However, her melodious laughter echoing through the vast structure. Considering that I've asked you to turn me into your familiar, I think we are well past such concerns. Percy smiled too, not disagreeing with that. The two didn't stop until the fourth room. It didn't look like it was the last one either, but Nephthys didn't bother to take another step, as they had already reached their destination. Percy's eyes fell on the object standing in the middle of the vast hall, the only thing he had seen in the entire pyramid other than the people and their beds. It was a massive urn, large enough to fit a dozen men, standing on a metallic tripod. Interestingly, the moment the two had entered the room, Percy had felt a little different, various ideas springing inside his mind one after the other, filling him with endless inspiration. And this wasn't the first time he had experienced something like this, though it was far more pronounced than before. Wiseman's dust, he blurted out, his incredulous expression probably betraying his shock. Nephthys shrugged. You're gonna have to explain what that is. Right, sorry? As much as Razif's mind helped him communicate with Nephthys, it couldn't really do much when it came to terms that either him or the Amenthei lacked the words to translate to. Over the next couple of minutes, he gave the goddess a brief rundown of his time on Felmara. I see, she said once he was done with his explanation, but she shook her head the following moment. This is something quite similar to what you've described, but it's not exactly the same thing. I'm sure I'm not the first one to discover it, yet I have no idea what its name is. For now, let's just call it Wiseman's Murmurs. Isn't it the same thing? Percy asked. Not quite. Remember that this isn't a physical world. Nephthys explained. I did produce that thing you mentioned during my ascension. It was useless for me, so I gave it to my subordinates. It seemed to help them develop their magic, but it got used up after a couple of centuries. Percy creased his brow. What about this? He asked again, pointing at the urn. It sure doesn't feel any different. Or rather, I'd say it's even more potent, though that might just be due to its quantity. Nephthys shrugged. The thing you call Wiseman's dust came from my body's impurities. This thing came from my mind instead. You may want to think of it as the ideas, thoughts, and beliefs I discarded while becoming a goddess. I suppose I wouldn't have even noticed it or managed to collect it if I didn't have a mind affinity, which might be why you haven't heard of it before, but I can't be certain about that. How come you didn't lend this one to your subordinates then? I tried. It manifested in here during my ascension, and I haven't been able to take it out. It just disappears if I do, and I didn't have the heart to get rid of it. The only way for somebody else to use it would be to come in here, but they'd have to lose their bodies for that. Leaving the obvious problems with that aside, they wouldn't even have a core in this place, so they wouldn't be able to practice their magic anyway. And you think I'll be different? Well, if my soul, and whatever's left of my internal world, are going to be floating inside your own for the next couple of years, as we are hoping they will, there's a chance. Percy nodded. Part of him wanted to refuse, not quite ready to accept something this precious. Even a handful of Wiseman's dust was valuable enough that the entire academy had guarded it and carefully rationed it for centuries, let alone such a massive stash. But he dismissed his silly thoughts fairly quickly. First, it was clear that nobody else was even able to use this thing. Furthermore, Nephthys' very survival was going to be tied to his own, so there was no better investment for her than to gift him this. I'm glad you understand, she said, smiling brightly. Are you ready to start? He asked, feeling a bit anxious. I am. Keep in mind that I'll have to sacrifice much of my soul and my internal world so that you can carry it. I will probably fall into deep slumber even after you bring us out of Amenthès. I doubt I'll be in any condition to talk to you before you place us in the new body. Percy frowned. But what if I need to ask your opinion on something? I might be forced to give you a different body, or to do something risky. Nephthys shook her head. Just go with your judgment. We will follow your decisions, whatever they may be. Well, it's not like we have much of a choice in the matter anyway. All I will ask is that you keep my people's well-being close to your heart. Hearing her words, he clenched his jaw, the weight of the deity's hopes and dreams feeling heavy on his shoulders. That's a lot of trust you're placing on somebody you've just met, he muttered. It's true that I haven't known you for long, Percy, but I do trust you, she nodded. I'm sure you can't quite say the same about me, however, since you can't read my thoughts. Don't think I didn't notice those fleeting suspicions passing through your mind every few seconds. Percy felt some heat gather in his cheeks, but he didn't deny her accusations. The truth was, he didn't fully trust the goddess yet. How could he? She had certainly done a great job presenting him with the most approachable image possible, but he'd be a fool to believe everything a stranger told him. Certainly when talking about one as old and wise as her. She was obviously powerful and desperate enough to do whatever she had to survive. He was also worried that she had done something to mess with his thoughts. It wasn't impossible, given her affinity. At the same time, he hadn't forgotten Metatron's claim that hijacking his main body through his clones would have been difficult to pull off, even for one such as her. Regardless, Percy didn't want to doom an entire civilization due to his mistrust, so he had tentatively decided to help Nephthys back for now, and ask Zoras for his opinion before doing anything more. In any case, she was about to butcher her soul quite extensively to make the trip, so he doubted she'd be in any position to harm him later, even if she harbored ill intentions. By the time they reached Remir, she would probably be even weaker than a mortal. If Percy wanted to create another familiar, he'd have to trust somebody anyway, so he might as well give her that opportunity. This novel's true home is a different platform. Support the author by finding it there. The goddess chuckled again. Don't be ashamed of your suspicions. I would have been a lot more reserved about placing my people's future in your hands, had you been gullible enough to believe me without question. But I didn't lie to you, nor do I wish for anything but our mutual benefit. I hope you come to realize that sooner, rather than later. Percy was about to respond, but the goddess never gave him the chance. A deep rumble permeated the structure, as cracks formed on the red stones all around him. Chunks fell one after the other, shattering into dust before they even hit the floor. The dust didn't last long either, quickly fading away into nothing. Unable to stand his ground against the violent quakes, Percy fell to his knees, holding himself up with his palms. The room started to shrink rapidly, and it wasn't the only thing. Razif's body appeared to shrink right with it, as did the goddess's. Red shards fell off from them too, as if they were nothing more than a couple of animated statues. Their clothes and skins stretched, twisted and squirmed, filling the newly formed gaps, ensuring they looked exactly the same, regardless of how tiny they got. Even his host's soul started to crumble, silver wisps peeling away in quick succession, as Percy's own soul spilled out of the ever-narrowing gaps. There were only two things in the room that weren't affected by the transformation in the slightest. The first was naturally Percy's soul. It retained its original size throughout the whole thing, though it looked like it was growing with respect to everything else. Of course, Percy himself could only see it via his host's eyes. So from his perspective, it looked like a gray substance was pouring out of Razif's body, flooding the room. The second object was the urn. Or rather, it was its contents, the Wiseman's Murmurs, as Nephthys had hastily nicknamed them. The urn itself did shrink at first, before shattering from the internal pressure, as a translucent, pink dust filled the room. Shifting his attention to the shrinking goddess, Percy noticed she was staring intently at the hieroglyphs on the walls. The cracks spread through the text, ruining the entries, the stored memories, at a frightening rate. The past that Nephthys had worked so hard to preserve, both her own and that of her people, was crumbling right in front of her eyes. She gritted her teeth, clearly trying to control where the cracks appeared, and which sections of the sanctuary broke or shrunk, in an attempt to protect as much of it as she could. Nephthys had maintained her composure throughout their conversation, appearing casual and unaffected by the horrors she had endured over the years, but Percy could tell that was just a front. Forced to choose between her people's future or their past, she had clearly picked the former, willing to toss everything else in the garbage, and to even place her trust in a mortal, a myriad times younger than her. "I'll do my best to live up to your hopes," he said, his eyes burning with determination. Nephthys didn't even turn to look at him, but he knew she had heard him. He could tell, by the faint smile tugging at her lips, washing away some of the sorrow in her expression. It didn't take long for both Percy's soul and the rising tide of pink powder to fill the hall. The latter gushed through the exits, already rushing through the neighboring rooms, while the former wasn't bound by such constraints, phasing freely through the floor and ceiling. At some point, he lost access to Razif's senses. Or rather, he voluntarily retracted from many of the man's injuries, unwilling to worsen them as his soul continued to grow, relatively speaking. He kept part of his soul inside his host's body, however, as he couldn't afford to forsake their connection entirely, lest he wasted all of Nephthys' efforts. The rest, he wrapped tightly around Razif's fake body, anchoring himself as best as he could to the shrinking sanctuary. A few seconds later, he felt more souls pressing against his own. They were small, like Razif's, feeling more like pebble-sized dolls than people. Under other circumstances, he would have questioned whether they could even survive like this, but he understood the goddess had overseen the process, carefully compressing and protecting her subjects using her internal world. Eventually, Percy's wisp felt as large as the entire pyramid, struggling to grow any larger. Or rather, the sanctuary continued to shrink like before, but an external pressure now forced his soul to shrink with it. It was the inviolable radiance of Nephthys' own soul, bright, dense, and absolute, cutting his expansion short. This was his first time being near such a powerful soul, which caused him to shudder at first, thinking that merely touching it would incinerate his wisp in an instant. However, that couldn't have been farther from the truth. The silver sun appeared just as gentle and warm as the goddess herself, taking great care not to harm him. "Try to empty some space in the pyramid for me," her crisp voice suddenly said, ringing through his mind. "I have to squeeze as much of my soul in there as I can." At the same time, the dense substance surrounding him receded a little, giving him room to expand outside the structure. Following her instructions, Percy withdrew as much of himself as he could, leaving only a single tendril reaching into the pyramid, wrapping around and inside Razif's body, that he had to keep, else he would lose his ability to interact with everything else. Nephthys didn't miss the opportunity to enter her internal world herself, torrents of silver rushing into the object. Percy watched with his non-existent mouth agape, unable to fathom how she could exert such delicate control over her soul even without his bloodline, affinity, or experience to help her. Then again, he'd be a fool to expect any less from her. Once it felt like the pyramid couldn't shrink any further, nor contain another drop of her soul, Percy felt a loud shockwave reverberate through him. At first, he didn't understand what had happened, at least until he felt the colossal chunks of silver around him drift away one after another. Nephthys had detonated the rest of her soul, literally destroying anything she had failed to stash inside the pyramid. Without Percy's gifts, this was the only method she had to help him carry her home. "Let's do this then." Wrapping his wisp around the object, the whole thing was about as small as a tangerine right now. Percy then tugged at his cord, trying to unlodge himself from the goddess's dying body. The pyramid did feel quite heavy, but not nearly as much as he had expected it to. The goddess hadn't lied when she told him she could help with this. Pulling with all his might, he felt his soul stretch and tear. Luckily, the pyramid budged too, filling him with hope. The pain was great, but he'd felt worse, and so had the Amenthei. Gritting his figurative teeth, Percy kept at it for a couple of minutes, eventually blasting away at a dizzying speed. He shot toward Remir, hundreds of souls sleeping soundly in his embrace. There would be many obstacles to overcome before he could help any of them, be it verifying the sincerity of the goddess's words, getting his hands on a suitable host to stuff them in, and hell, even surviving long enough to make all of that happen. But one thing was crystal clear: "I'll do my best." A giant bird was gliding over the lush forest, close enough for the rustling canopies below to be heard. The whistling gales rushing against its plumage did cover the sound somewhat, but they didn't impede its movement all that much. If one paid close attention, they'd notice that the wind parted by itself before touching the creature's strangely colored feathers, aiding rather than hindering it in its flight. Sitting on its back, surrounded by glowing lines of 3 different colors, was a tall, lean man. His long, unkempt dark hair was fluttering behind him, a few strands stuck to his face by the pressure. He didn't seem to pay them any attention, however, his piercing gaze focused on the bluish-gray mana in his hands. The ethereal strings held for a while, but eventually snapped when he pulled at them with enough force. "Almost there," he said as he scratched his scruffy beard, not letting his millionth failure dampen his mood. This was naturally Percy, riding on his familiar as the two traveled across the continent, trying to lose any potential pursuers. He'd already made a ton of progress with the mana threads, and he was confident they'd be finished in the next couple of weeks at the latest. He was currently mixing 6 variants of his reinforced mana, and he only had to fine-tune the substance a little more before he was satisfied with its properties. Of course, it wasn't as easy to concentrate while airborne, but he knew he had to get used to working like this, as they'd be spending a lot of their time on the move for the foreseeable future. It had been several days since they left the valley, and they'd covered a lot of ground. The forest they were currently flying over wasn't even the first one they'd encountered. Percy didn't know its name, but he could tell they had reached the wildlands by the northern side of the continent. Granted, they hadn't traveled in a straight line. Percy had instructed Mickey to vary his path every few hours, and to stay closer to the ground, to lower the odds of them being spotted. Their caution had served them well so far, though it appeared their luck had finally run out. "Percy," Mickey suddenly said, opting to do so via their connection. "Yeah, I noticed them too," Percy replied, nodding grimly. A few hundred meters to their left, two men were currently floating above the trees, slowly approaching them. One of them was sitting on an azure mat made of a squirming blob of water. The other required no aid to fly, or the air itself holding him up. Percy didn't even turn to look at them. His mana sense was more than enough for him to discern both their affinities and their grades. "Two blues. You feeling good about it?" "I'll do my best," Mickey sent back. Percy sighed, knowing there was no avoiding the fight. Not that Mickey was too slow to escape, quite the opposite, in fact. Even before his recent advancements, the Crow had managed to keep his distance from Acton for multiple days, let alone now. But they couldn't avoid fighting forever. Sooner or later, they'd get in a situation where fleeing wasn't an option. They should probably take advantage of this opportunity to get some more practice fighting blues. A couple of them would make for a reasonable challenge, neither too few, nor too many. It was exactly the kind of opposition they needed to grow. Of course, Percy had already killed one, and he was confident his boosting art had placed his fighting strength solidly in that grade. Still, he wasn't arrogant enough to think he could suddenly beat every blue on Remir with ease. He'd certainly never fought in the air before, so he knew he'd be at a disadvantage against these people. All the more reason to go through with it, though. At least Mickey would be in his element. In any case, their opponents seemed to realize they'd been spotted at some point, abandoning all caution. They approached them quickly, though they still paused some distance away, clearly not in a rush to engage. Another thing Percy noticed was that the blues appeared strangely confident in their chances, not a hint of nervousness showing in their expressions. Obviously, it was true that they were strong enough to give him and Mickey a tough fight, but they shouldn't know that. Did the root not spread the fact that we've killed 5 blues in total? Or did they never figure it out in the first place? Both possibilities held merit. From his perspective, the events inside the valley had transpired over entire decades. From the outside, however, just over a year had passed. Perhaps, the Root's higher-ups had never realized how many of Acton's guards had advanced by the time they died. It would have been a rather absurd assumption to make too, since it would imply Percy's group was powerful enough to take an entire house on. Or maybe they fully understood what had happened, and they'd just chosen to keep the information to themselves. After all, they clearly wanted other houses to help them hunt Percy down, if only to put more pressure on him and force him to stay on the move. Telling the whole world that their target was nearly as strong as a violet would have deterred over 90% of the noble houses from sending their blues to their death. The narrative has been illicitly obtained. Should you discover it on Amazon, report the violation. Well, it doesn't matter. They might not know the full truth, but Elaine is no longer with us, so it works out the same. Standing up on Mickey's back, he faced the 2 mages. Judging from the occasional strand of gray hair on their heads, he could tell they were probably Orangeborns, having lived for centuries to reach their current grade. They didn't look old per se, just middle-aged. Definitely more experienced than Acton or Femel, though. Pushing the carnival to its limits, he felt his muscles swell with strength, his skin reddening and even tearing in a couple of spots. The gray wisps danced erratically around him, leaving burning trails in their wake as their shrill cries filled the air. Percy had grown a lot better at handling the spell over the past couple of months, but he'd still prefer to finish the fight quickly if possible. 2 powerful domains suddenly descended upon him and Mickey, causing them both to shudder. The pressure was immense, especially when stacked like this, but they could still move, which elicited some surprise from their opponents. It appears the rumors are true. I suppose it's only to be expected, considering that it's the root spreading them. Still, I admit I was a little skeptical at first, the water mage said. His voice wasn't very loud, and the two sides were separated by over 100 meters, but everyone here had enhanced hearing enough to communicate without issue. The second man nodded. When our patriarch told us Femel was slain by a yellow, I thought he had lost his mind. I guess I only have my own lack of imagination to blame. Who would have thought such a freak would appear on our world? Listening to their words, Percy couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. Femel? Is that what they're focusing on? Granted, the deceased young man had been a holy child, so it wasn't surprising that his death would anger the noble houses. However, Percy still found their choice of words rather odd. They hadn't even mentioned Acton or any of his other crimes. Despite the fact that Percy's grudge had initially started with him, thinking of something, he scanned their clothes, paying closer attention to their insignias. They weren't as flashy as those of some other houses. They merely depicted a pair of hands held together. Percy had never learned Femel's surname, since the Greenborn had been dressed in the Order's colors by the time Elaine killed him, but the symbolism seemed to fit with his bloodline. "Was he from your house?" he asked. "Afraid so. We don't much care about your other issues with the Order, at least not enough to send 2 blues after you. But our patriarch will never forgive you for killing his youngest son, the pride of our family." Percy sighed. "I don't suppose you'll tell me how you found us so quickly?" he asked back. He definitely raised some commotion while leaving Kronos' decree, but he didn't think enough time had passed for people to not only piece the situation together, but to also spread the news about him across Remir, deploy a bunch of blues after him, and even catch up to him this far out. Something else was clearly at play. "Why would we tell you that?" the water mage asked with a frown. "How about we make a deal?" Percy replied with a question of his own. Next, he took out a folded piece of paper from his spatial seal that he'd prepared beforehand, tossing it at them. The fragile object would have never made it across by itself, but the air mage grabbed hold of it with his mana, having a gentle breeze carry it to his hand. Opening it, his eyes widened as he read its contents. Curiously, the water mage's expression also lit up in surprise just a moment later, despite the fact that he was too far to read the note, and that his friend hadn't uttered a word. He hid his shock quickly enough, but Percy hadn't missed it. Telepathic communication? They must have the same bloodline as Femel. It would be troublesome. They were from the same family too, and they'd probably fought countless battles together. Considering how crude his teamwork with Mickey was, by comparison, their best bet would be to separate them. "Why are you giving us this?" the air mage suddenly asked, oblivious to his thoughts. What Percy had written down was the secret of the Aurora Dew and instructions for mastering the dance. Of course, he'd only given them half of the information for either topic, the rest hidden in one of his spatial amulets. "Tell me what I want to know, and you can loot the rest of the information from my corpse. Or I can just destroy it before we even fight." "You're lying. Why would you give us something so important?" the water mage asked. Percy shrugged. "It won't be of any use to me if I die, though I'm not planning to. I'd never intended to take this information to my grave. I'd always wanted to spread it to the rest of Remir at some point, after giving myself a head start. If you beat me, I'd actually prefer that this knowledge lives on with you. If you don't, well, I suppose I'll get to keep my secrets for a while longer." What he'd left unsaid was that he wasn't the only one aware of this information. Elaine, Nesha, Galahad, Archibald, and Orin all knew much of this too, so these discoveries wouldn't really be lost if he died. However, Percy didn't want his friends and family to end up in the same position as him. Surrendering his secrets was his way of protecting them, at least the ones who hadn't been captured already. "I see," the water mage said, seemingly appraising Percy once more, his eyes looking at him in a new light. "Perhaps the rumors aren't quite right about you after all. You seem more sensible than they give you credit for." He sighed, exchanging a glance with the other blue, the air mage nodding back. "We didn't track you. We tracked him," he said, pointing at Mickey with his chin. "Our patriarch used his secret art to place a mark on Femel's body. It allows anyone with our bloodline to find him, dead or alive. Since we didn't find any trace of him inside the valley, it wasn't hard to guess you'd fed him to the crow." Percy grimaced upon hearing that, not happy about this at all, though he calmed himself down the very next moment. He didn't know how many blues their house possessed, but deploying even one shouldn't have been easy, let alone two. Once they died, their patriarch would have to think twice before sending another. "How long does the mark last?" he asked, trying his luck, though he didn't really expect an answer. Sure enough, the air mage shook his head. "That wasn't part of our deal." Percy shrugged, summoning a pair of scythes to his hands. There was no point worrying about the mark anyway. Not before they made it through this fight. Jumping off Mickey, he allowed the gray wisps to ignite his weapons. Each of the harvesters broke into a dozen pieces, multiplying rapidly as the ambient mana flooded their enchantments. Mere seconds later, a storm of crescent blades spun around Percy, a couple of scythes soon crossing their shafts beneath his feet to arrest his fall. The blues followed suit, unleashing their apocalyptic spells upon him and Mickey, torrents of water and wind covering the aerial battlefield. The crow pushed his boosting art to its limits too, as the four combatants prepared for battle. They all understood that half of them, at best, wouldn't live to fight another. Mages could use their mana to fly as early as green. The ease by which they did that often depended on their affinity and whatever else they had going for them, but it was generally possible for them to maneuver for at least a limited time in the air. It wasn't until blue that this skill became effortless for everyone, though enough to fight for an extended period of time while airborne. This was something Percy had always looked forward to as a child. In his opinion, the sheer freedom that came with soaring through the sky with 1 ounce power was one of the greatest allures of magic. Obviously, he was neither a blue nor a green just yet, but he'd guessed he had more than enough mana, as well as sufficient control over it, to pull this off. Sure enough, it hadn't been that difficult for him to use his replicating scythes as footholds, leaping from one crossed pair of shafts to another. His phantoms clung to the burning constructs, like loyal soldiers holding their weapons up for their emperor to tread on. If only these bastards would give me a few minutes to enjoy it. Sadly, Percy had his hands full with dodging the relentless onslaught of the two blues. Violent torrents of water and sharp gales of wind alike tried to shred him to pieces, as he struggled to keep the number of harvesters steady inside the stacked domains. Glancing over at Mickey, he quickly realized his familiar wasn't having a great time either. Sure, he didn't have to go through so many hoops to stay in the fight. He was both faster and more experienced than him at flying. However, he was also less nimble and much larger, offering a better target for their enemies. And that wasn't even the only problem they had to deal with. "You two doing okay?" Percy asked his clone, before suppressing the cord again. Ever since the upgrade to his secret art, they had been forced to use the connection sparingly, as they weren't ready to handle the excess information yet. In theory, they could effortlessly tap into each other's thoughts and senses, but they currently found that more confusing than helpful. Artificially handicapping themselves was quite pathetic, but they understood that mastering the new spell wouldn't happen in a month or two. "Not really. We got hit a bunch of times already. Nothing serious yet, but we won't be able to keep this up forever," the clone replied. As for Mickey himself, he was probably too busy avoiding the attacks to join the conversation. Percy gritted his teeth, trying to think of a way out of this mess. Resisting 2 domains at once was already hard, and that was without considering how skilled the blues were at covering each other. No matter what, they'd have to split them up. Of course, this was something he had realized even before the start of the battle, but making it happen wasn't that simple. The water mage was clearly in charge of defense. He had manifested several azure serpents, some of them coiling around him for protection, while the rest roamed the battlefield. Whenever his teammate was about to get hit, they got in the way of Percy's attacks. Whenever they were free, they attacked him or Mickey instead, putting pressure on them both. Meanwhile, the air mage was almost impossible to grab a hold of. He constantly whizzed around them, shooting smaller but much faster spells from every angle. "I don't see us budging the water mage from his spot anytime soon. Our best bet is to pile on the other guy and force him away. As soon as their domains stop overlapping, it'll be easier to keep them apart," Percy suggested at some point. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only thing he could come up with. "All right, Let's focus our spells on him as soon as we get an opening, the clone replied after a while, having probably discussed their strategy with Mickey. Over the next few minutes, Percy and Mickey stayed on the defensive, the former trying to amass as many scythes as he could for the attack, while the latter did everything he could to minimize the damage he took. Eventually, an opportunity presented itself. Percy jumped through the narrow gap between two of the azure serpents, closing the distance to the water mage. Meanwhile, the air mage had overextended a little while pursuing Mickey. This narrative has been unlawfully taken from Novelbin. If you see it on Amazon, please report it. Now, he said, aiming all of his free harvesters at the water mage, the burning blades closing in on him from every direction. Raising an eyebrow, the water mage retracted more of his own constructs, forming a handful of dense rings spinning rapidly around him in an attempt to block the incoming attacks. Percy's lips curled up, however, as he diverted the spell at the last second, sending 2/3 of his constructs after the air mage instead. Caught by surprise, the latter had to halt his attack on Mickey, propelling himself away from the flock of weapons. Having expected that, Mickey opened his wings wide, using the rush of wind to slow himself down. Falling just behind the air mage, he sent a barrage of sharp icicles at him, joining forces with Percy to block the man's escape path. Left with no other choice, the air mage flew ahead, the burning scythes and the frozen shards rushing after him. Of course, the water mage didn't just sit back as Percy and Mickey ganged up on his teammate. Sending some of his serpents after Percy again, he put some pressure on him to weaken his assault on the air mage. Sure enough, Percy withdrew some of his weapons, his flock growing clumsier, slower and less accurate as his attention got peeled away from the pursuit. Mickey wasn't about to let their efforts go to waste, however. Picking up the slack, he unleashed a lot of his spare mana, shooting more icicles to prevent the air mage from circling back. Draining his reserves would obviously make the subsequent fight much harder, but he probably understood that the removal of the second domain would help even more. Clearly unwilling to concede his advantage so easily, the air mage also went all out, crushing some of the shards as he evaded others. At the same time, he desperately searched for an opening to return to his companion. He might have succeeded too, if he hadn't already traveled far enough. Percy soon noticed that the second domain was already a lot weaker. It wasn't entirely gone just yet, but he found it easier to dodge the azure serpents, and he guessed his familiar should have experienced some changes too. Tossing a fleeting glance at the other end of the battlefield, he confirmed that the crow was flying and attacking a little faster than before. He was glued behind the air mage, chasing him farther and farther with each powerful flap of his wings, and each brutal barrage of icicles he unleashed. Before long, the domains fully separated, allowing Percy to exhale in relief. Finally, he spat, shifting the rest of his attention to his own opponent. Splitting them up hadn't come without a cost. Mickey had used up much of his mana, and Percy had been forced to sacrifice more than half of his accumulated constructs. Still, he was confident they could both build their strength back up again if they fought cautiously for a few minutes. Everything considered, he felt good about their chances. That only lasted until his opponent grinned, however. That was a lot of effort you've put into splitting us up. Did you think this would give you an advantage? Percy didn't even get a chance to reply, when the water mage released a lot more mana from his core, causing his constructs to enlarge and to accelerate. A series of giant rivers snaked all over the place, covering the battlefield in countless chaotic arcs. Ferocious serpents descended upon Percy one after another, causing him to dodge by the skin of his teeth. Whenever he was about to avoid a blow, the domain around him intensified for a moment, slowing his body down and messing with his control over his mana. His steps grew sluggish, many of his scythes even failing to repair themselves as each of his opponent's attacks came closer to injuring him than the last. Knowing he couldn't just keep defending, Percy sent many of his spare scythes after the water mage, trying to lift some pressure off himself. The weapons spun toward their target, about to sink their curved edges through the gaps between the azure rings. That never happened, however. Suddenly, the rings sped up in two directions. The water flowing through them did so much faster, and the rings also revolved around the mage rapidly, blocking all of Percy's attacks without fail. The harvesters made crisp tings as they collided against the compressed water, their edges shattering into a million pieces. Percy frowned at the sight. This feels more like trying to stab through stone with a toothpick than slashing through water with a blade. The only silver lining was that the pressure around him had lessened momentarily, allowing him to move a little faster for a few seconds. That didn't last long, however, the force returning as soon as the rings were done diffusing his offensive. He's so much better at manipulating his domain than Acton, Percy realized grimly. This person didn't even have an earth or a mud affinity. Just water. Yet his defenses were even harder to breach than the deceased Greenborn's. Even worse, he was able to move his domain around seamlessly, alternating between enveloping the entire battlefield to slow Percy down, or using it to empower his spells. "Don't feel so bad," the old man consoled. "Separating us was a smart move. Unfortunately for you, our enemies have been using it against our house for centuries. I'm afraid we've long learned to fight separately as well as we can together." Percy had no retort, knowing the man was right. What the two veterans had lost in coordination or their stacked domains, they'd clearly made up for in other ways. He didn't know about the other guy, but the water mage was able to use both his domain and his mana a lot more aggressively now that he didn't have to worry about getting in his companion's way. So focused had he and Mickey been on splitting the old monsters up, that they'd played right into their hands. The speed of the Azure Serpents alone wasn't enough to corner Percy. But that wasn't the only issue. The man's domain didn't just slow him down, it also made it much harder for him to multiply his scythes, which served not only as his sole means of attack, but also as the footholds he relied on to remain airborne. Worse still, the water mage was clearly experienced enough to see through Percy's moves after a while. It wasn't long before he started attacking the scythes directly, using his domain-infused constructs to destroy the weapons even when he failed to catch Percy. He often blocked Percy's path too, knowing his movements were limited to leaping from one pair of scythes to another. Of course, Percy hadn't remained idle either. His eyes had long adjusted to the man's spells, allowing him to predict their trajectories and move both himself and his constructs away. Whenever they were damaged, he kept them at a fair distance from the battlefield. This gave them a chance to repair and replicate themselves before he brought them back in. Even his own moves had continued to grow sharper and more complex with each step he took, as he rapidly adapted the carnival to its aerial variant. That said, he was still at a severe disadvantage. Trapped between the raging rivers, Percy didn't have much breathing room. He couldn't really approach nor escape from his opponent, and a lot of his attention was spent just surviving the relentless onslaught. His eyes may have adjusted to the man's mana, but they had a much harder time predicting the sudden shifts of his domain, since that only relied on willpower. It wasn't entirely impossible to peer through the water mage's intentions, since soul vision still worked, but it wasn't nearly as informative without mana sense complementing it. Another issue was that his counterattacks had been doomed from the start. Percy had never stopped looking for an opening to fight back, but his scythes never managed to carve deeper than an inch into the dense rings protecting his opponent, no matter how many he used or what formation he placed them in. Not that he could afford to stop trying. He certainly needed the occasional chance to catch his breath that his attacks bought him, but he understood he'd never win like this. "Come on, think. There must be something we can do." The water mage's greatest strength was clearly his defense. Not that his speed and offense were lacking, but Percy could at least deal with those. On the other hand, he just couldn't come up with a way to breach the rings. His scythes were already made out of reinforced mana, enchanted with some of his best runes. Even if he could invent something better, he wasn't confident he could do it in the midst of combat. From what little he'd managed to communicate with his clone, he knew Mickey wasn't doing well either. The air mage was also free to use his magic without constraints, having already landed countless blows on the crow. His spells weren't as powerful as his companions, and Mickey was a lot tougher than a regular green beast, but the damage was piling up quickly, the bird already a bloody mess. It wouldn't be long before it caused his fighting strength to dip, and it would all go downhill from there. This isn't sustainable. The bastards have tricked us into some bad matchups. Strictly speaking, their opponents were still a little weaker while separated than they had been together. Joining them up again would be ill-advised. But the enemy mages had certainly done a great job forcing him and Mickey to each pick the wrong opponent. Mickey's attacks hit harder than Percy's, so he might have managed to break through the water mage's rings with his rending tornado. At the same time, Percy was confident he would have done a better job evading the air mage's attacks had he been in his familiar's shoes. "Can we try swapping?" he wondered. It was the obvious solution, though it wouldn't be an easy one to execute. They'd gone through so much trouble to split them up in the first place, and even holding them apart had been a challenge. Mickey had probably been forced to eat several blows to keep his opponent from escaping. The air user wasn't faster than Mickey in a straight line, but he was definitely the most agile person on the battlefield right now. This narrative has been purloined without the author's approval. Report any appearances on Amazon. No, even if we manage to do it, I'm not sure I can catch that guy fast enough by myself, he thought, dodging another serpent shooting for his head. It was speed, their greatest limiting factor in this fight. Offensive power too, but he didn't think he could improve on that in the short term. Speed, on the other hand, he might be able to do something about. Over the next few seconds, Percy focused on his boosting art, examining the flaws in his technique. The carnival was already an extremely advanced masterful spell, so he didn't delude himself into believing that he could upgrade it anytime soon. However, it was also an entire fighting style, and Percy was fully aware that he had barely scratched the surface of his potential during his fight against Acton. In fact, it would be quite greedy of him to ask for a stronger spell. Foolish of him, too, to neglect what he could still accomplish with this one. Percy should have all the tools he needed to solve this puzzle. He just had to try a little harder to fit them together. My timing can use a lot of work, he realized. He was currently moving by jumping from one pair of crossed shafts to another, but that seemingly simple action involved countless components. There was the force exerted by the muscles in his legs, but also that of his willpower acting on the mana inside his channels, pulling him around like a marionette on its strings. There were the constructs, his very footholds, bending and snapping back under his weight, their strength and their enchantments keeping them from breaking. There was also the momentum of the scythes. If they flew toward a certain direction before he stepped on them, they could pass some of their energy to him during the collision. Then there was his armor. He could manipulate the mana inside it too, dragging his body around. Yet, that was but a single aspect in which his regalia contributed to his movements. Another was his ability to turn parts of it intangible. He could do that selectively while flying to minimize both his weight and the air resistance slowing him down. Finally, the fused mana spilling out of his pores could also be harnessed. It wouldn't be as good at this as air or fire mana, but he could still use it to propel himself some more if he timed it right. His best bet was to fine-tune all these elements to maximize his speed. It could work, but I need to get there fast, or Mickey is screwed. Not wasting a moment, Percy immersed himself into the spell, examining how all these components came together. Lifting part of his attention off his opponent instantly put him at a disadvantage, as the water serpents came closer and closer to ripping him apart, occasionally even glancing his armor and shredding pieces of it off. But the improvements started to make up for it. Every jump was a little faster. The difference was minuscule at first, barely noticeable. But it was consistent and it kept accumulating. Percy tested the strength of his constructs, trying to figure out how much they could bend without breaking. He lost his foothold a few times, nearly getting hit by the water spells. Fortunately, Percy managed to get away each time, the suddenness of his failures catching his opponent by surprise. The grin on the man's face still widened, the fool probably thinking it was Percy's exhaustion getting to him, not realizing he was just experimenting with his spell. It didn't take Percy long to understand how far he could push the weapons, however, his speed climbing as a result. Next, he worked on his muscles. He didn't just use the ones in his legs, but also the ones in his torso, trying to summon every drop of strength his body could muster with each step. His mana was actually even easier to use. His feet could only exert force while they were in contact with the scythes, But the same limitation didn't apply to the mana inside his channels or armor, that he could use even while he was in flight to keep accelerating between jumps. The only thing he had to worry about was to shift the direction of this force at the right moment, to minimize the losses. Soon, he found himself whizzing around his opponent no slower than the air mage had done at the start of the battle. It didn't take him long to start avoiding the man's spells well in advance, bolting through the battlefield like a gray streak, leaping from platform to platform. Even better, the more accustomed he grew to his own movements, the easier it was for his phantoms to replicate them. At some point, there were dozens of ghostly figures looking just like him, mirroring his actions to confuse the water mage. Destroying them, or at least identifying the original with his domain, wasn't hard, but each of those solutions forced the man to spread his willpower thin, allowing Percy to move even faster. Still, Percy wasn't in a rush to escape toward Mickey. If he tried to swap with him now, their opponents would follow suit. With both of them moving closer, their domains would mix again long before Percy bridged the gap. It wasn't enough to just get a little faster than the air mage. He had to outrun both of them combined. "What did you do?" the clone asked. This guy suddenly got more anxious. Percy grinned. His opponent had clearly realized what he was up to, relaying the information to his teammate. "Either way, it wouldn't matter. I need you to buy me a few more minutes. Can you manage?" A wave of annoyance seeped through the connection, but the clone didn't say anything, tacitly agreeing to let him do his thing. Not wasting a moment, Percy focused on his developing technique once more, fully aware that he was operating on a strict timer. None of this would be worth it if his familiar was seriously injured by the time he was done. Regardless, he understood this was their best shot. The good news was that he no longer had to worry about his opponent landing a hit, as his speed had already eclipsed the water mage's spells. New issues had emerged, however. Percy's whole body hurt, even the parts not directly involved in his high-speed movements. The pain in his hands wasn't as bad as that in his legs and torso, but he had kept the carnival active for quite a while now, and it was beginning to take its toll on him. His surroundings had turned blurry in his vision, as even his mutated eyes struggled to keep up with the influx of information. It didn't help that he had to keep his gaze locked on his opponent's frame. He couldn't afford to stop predicting the man's spells, or he could easily run into them by accident. "It'll have to do," he nodded internally after a while. There was still room for improvement, probably, but he was already experiencing diminishing returns. Practicing any longer would hurt both himself and Mickey with very little to show for it. "We're swapping," he sent through the cord. "I'm gonna need you to hold the other one busy for a while. I know it'll be tough, but I'll try to make it quick." Percy didn't even wait for an answer, sending all his scythes toward Mickey's general direction, leaping from shaft to shaft at a ridiculous pace. In an instant, the water mage was dozens of meters behind him, though he was already on his tail. At his current speed, he wasn't going to catch up anytime soon, but they both understood he didn't have to. He only needed his domain to reach that of his teammate to make Percy's life a lot harder. Gritting his teeth, Percy ran as fast as he could manage. This was his first time fighting in the sky, but he'd never traveled like this on land either. Before long, he vaguely caught sight of a large shape brushing just under him. He didn't get a good look at Mickey, but from what little he did see, Percy could tell the crow's injuries were even worse than he'd imagined. "Hang in there, buddy." Right behind the bird was the air mage, also doing his best to meet up with his companion. By the time Percy reached him, the two domains had actually touched again, but the stacked effect was weak enough to mostly ignore for now. That said, it was still in Percy's best interest to push him away, or kill him, whichever came first. Naturally, the man didn't just wait passively for his execution. The moment Percy approached, he shot countless crescents of wind at him, trying to slice him to pieces. Caught up in his momentum, and having trouble scanning his surroundings, Percy nearly got hit. He barely managed to leap out of the way at the last second, the green blades carving through the scythes he had just stepped on as if they were butter. Clearly, his opponent had infused his domain into the spells. Percy responded by hurling some of his spare constructs at him, forcing him to dodge. The man unleashed controlled bursts of wind from every part of his body, whizzing around like the world's most annoying mosquito. Then again, Percy shouldn't be complaining, since he was no less difficult to grab a hold of himself. Doesn't matter. I'll have to figure this out. Mickey won't last much longer. Unauthorized usage. This tale is on Amazon without the author's consent. Report any sightings. Sadly, his opponent made things harder for him by expelling a lot of his stored mana to form a colossal hurricane dozens of meters wide. Layering his domain on top of the cataclysmic spell, he forced the raging gusts of wind to fly even faster, like thousands of tiny blades making grating sounds as they collided against one another. The individual attacks weren't strong enough to injure Percy too badly. Even if he phased his armor through them, they would barely nick his skin. However, the pressure slowed down his movements, accelerating those of the air mage. Percy bounced around the hurricane, fighting against the wind. With each leap, he closed the gap to his slippery opponent by a few meters. Two scythes were gripped tightly in his hands, their curved edges gleaming with impatience as they hungered for the man's flesh. Of course, the veteran mage wouldn't go down without a fight. The more Percy struggled to approach, the more he fought to keep his distance, continuing to unleash more spells at him to block his path. He wasn't even trying to hit him. Everyone knew the battle would end the moment Mickey died, so the blue was more than happy to waste Percy's time. Percy evaded the green constructs one after another, until he figured he was close enough to his target to bridge the remaining gap with one last jump. Stomping hard on a pair of scythes, he twisted his torso to avoid an incoming spell, shooting at his opponent like a gray comet. Just when he was about to land the final blow, he faintly caught a savage grin on the man's face, however. The air user's soul flickered at the last second, betraying his intention to attack. Caught off guard, Percy crossed his weapons in front of him to block the blow. Not a drop of mana left the man's core, making Percy second-guess whether his opponent had merely feinted to get him to halt his offensive. His confusion didn't last long, though, an invisible blow slamming into his harvesters the very next moment. Both their shafts shattered, the blast continuing right to his chest. Percy barely managed to twist his torso again to deflect some of the force, but he was still sent flying back. The attack had shaved 2 layers off the left side of his breastplate and even cracked the third. The mage didn't wait for him to catch himself either, shooting more spells at him to turn him into minced meat. Percy managed to kick against a stray scythe spinning in his path, evading the attacks at the last second. Damn!" he groaned, sputtering a mouthful of blood as the pain registered. It took him several seconds to resume his rhythm, each leap sending a jolt of agony through his body. He wouldn't be surprised if that last attack had broken a rib or two. Not to mention that he hadn't been in the best condition to begin with, having struggled to endure the strain of his own movements. It's the same thing Acton did right at the end of our fight. A concentrated blast of willpower. It clearly wasn't easy to pull off, as the move had caused the domain around them to weaken. Even now, several seconds after the man's attack, it hadn't fully recovered. But it made for a very quick and deadly trump card. One that involved no mana, thus making it several times harder for Percy to predict. Percy sighed, emptying a couple vials of healing potions into his stomach. Unfortunately, he hadn't replaced his tattoos since the fight with the Greenborn, though he didn't regret it. He'd spent most of his time training with Mickey instead, which was probably the only reason his familiar was still alive. Over the next couple of seconds, he evaded his opponent's spells as he waited for the potions to relieve some of his pain and fatigue. At the same time, he reflected over his mistakes. He couldn't stop his opponent from sneak attacking him with his domain, but getting hit by it had partly been his fault. Losing his patience, he had foolishly charged at the man in a straight line. His movements might have been fast, but they had also been way too predictable. Not good enough. I need to vary my steps more, and I'll only get one more chance at this. He couldn't afford to get hit again. Even if the next blow didn't kill him directly, he doubted he'd be in any condition to fight after another mistake like that. Gathering his scythes around him again, Percy leapt from foothold to foothold, his gaze sinking into his opponent's frame once more. The two mages flew against the violent gales, the booming shocks of Percy's steps breaking through the cacophony of the grating winds and the shrill cries of the burning wisps. Percy rapidly closed the distance to the blue, though he wasn't in a rush to go for the finisher this time, knowing this was exactly what the man was waiting for. Instead, he focused on his movements again, searching for another way to improve his technique. I don't think I can move any faster than this, but I can probably do it in a smarter way. So far, Percy hadn't varied the distance between his platforms much. It was more convenient to keep the gaps constant, as it allowed him to get used to the timing. He now realized that wouldn't cut it, however, it only made him more predictable. Another thing he could do was to shift the angles of his scythes at the last second, altering his trajectory. It would make it harder to stick his landings, but it would also confuse his opponent. Determined to give this a shot, Percy moved the next foothold much closer, rotating the weapons just before he stepped on them. He obviously had to twist his body to make this work, though he did manage to execute the maneuver in the end. Naturally, he'd butchered the timing quite badly, but the sudden change in his movements did cause the blue to raise an eyebrow. Percy ignored his opponent's shock, too busy dealing with another issue. Wincing, he noticed that jumping twice in quick succession only furthered the strain on his joints. That said, he didn't let the pain get to him, thinking of a potential solution. I can pour more mana into the force absorption runes to protect my legs. He'd have to be careful not to overdo it, as they would also sap some of his momentum away, but the increased frequency of his jumps would make up for it, allowing him to pick up more speed regardless. This was promising. It could work. Capitalizing on his idea, Percy spent a few minutes fine-tuning his movements again, as his opponent helplessly did everything in his power to stop him. His spells never connected, however, not as long as Percy maintained a safe distance. Only when Percy felt confident did he attempt to close the gap again. Leaping from platform to platform, he rapidly approached the blue, nimbly evading the green crescents one after the other. His surroundings blurred again. Not only was he flying at his top speed, he was also doing it in a most chaotic manner this time, zigzagging around the battlefield in all sorts of random directions. Keeping his eyes locked onto his opponent throughout, Percy used the man's soul and mana core as his compass. It was both the target he desperately needed to reach and the source of all the obstacles he needed to avoid. The dizzying tapestry of colors around him dimmed and darkened as he concentrated, leaving only the most important shapes visible in his sight. Those were mainly the man's spells, at least the ones on course to hit him. But there was another thing. A silver flame, shining brightly. Like the light at the end of a tunnel, it illuminated the way forward. It was naturally the man's soul. No, not quite. It was the projection of his soul, where the mage would be in the following second. That was the thing that Percy needed to sink his scythes into at all costs. Jumping from scythe to scythe, he flew all over the battlefield, completely ignoring the violent hurricane trying to slow him down. Dancing in 3 dimensions, he chased after the silver flame relentlessly, the blue doing everything he could to stop him. Nothing worked. Percy evaded the spells one after another, inching closer and closer to his target with each painful step. Just when the end was within reach, a single jump away, Percy caught a subtle flicker in his opponent's soul. Having fully expected it this time, he shifted the angle of his scythes at the last second, altering his trajectory. He couldn't see the invisible blow, but he could tell he had just dodged another one of those nasty domain blasts, based on the scythes shattering in the distance, behind the spot where he had previously stood. With the danger now past, Percy was about to take the final step, when the man's soul flickered for the second time. Unauthorized duplication. This narrative has been taken without consent. Report sightings. The domain around them disappeared entirely, even the hurricane itself falling apart, as the blue gathered every drop of his willpower for another blast. Shit! I should have expected this, Percy grimaced, shifting his trajectory once again. Acton had been limited to a single shot, but it was a mistake to assume that somebody who had lived for over half a millennium would be subject to the same constraints. Hastily jumping to the nearest scythe, Percy barely managed to avoid the second blow. Or at least that was what he believed. Thinking he had just dealt with his opponent's last-ditch effort, Percy was about to finally pounce at the bastard, when he noticed that the second blast hadn't actually destroyed anything in its path, all of the scythes intact. A feint! Just as the realization settled in, the man's soul flickered for the third time. Caught in an awkward spot, Percy knew he wouldn't make the jump. Instead, he allowed the scythes beneath his boots to shatter, falling backward instead. The invisible blast whizzed mere inches above his head, sending a shiver down his spine. Had he been a fraction of a second slower, he would have eaten one nasty blow right to his face. This wasn't the time to worry about that, however. Rushing after the man again, Percy picked up speed, having no intention of waiting for him to recover his willpower. Even without his domain, the man still had plenty of mana left, and he clearly wasn't afraid to squander it. Not if it meant buying more time for himself. The silver flame fluttered erratically, the green crescents shooting at Percy once more. "No, you don't." A hiss died in Percy's throat as he took the final step. There were no more spells, nor any unexpected domain blasts. This was it. The silver light enlarged in Percy's vision, as he slashed at it with both of his scythes. At the same time, the name of his new technique flashed in his mind. Only it wasn't a notification from his status, nor was it a new spell. It was merely a name he had picked for it himself, the crystallization of his blood and sweat. The first step toward truly mastering his boosting art. Carnival of the Savage Gods. First parade, winding corridor. His momentum carried him several meters forward, as the world around him regained its color. Only then did Percy register that he was plummeting directly toward the ground. Evidently, he had attacked his opponent from above. He hadn't even noticed, unable to tell up from down, or right from left in that state. Hastily pulling a pair of scythes beneath his feet to arrest his fall, he looked up. A headless corpse and a severed head fell past him, two fountains of blood spraying out of the stumps. Disbelief still shone in the blue's eyes, though it was dimming away quickly. Coating himself in a thin layer of mana, Percy shielded his body from the gore as he scanned his surroundings. Ignoring his opponent's mutilated corpse, he flipped the scythe in his hand, hooking an amulet with its shaft. The thin chain slid down along the gray construct, ending in Percy's hand. Hastily wearing the device around his neck, he allowed it to phase through his armor before shooting towards Mickey. "What's the situation there?" The reply didn't come immediately. Percy was about to ask again when the clone finally answered. "Not good. Mickey's body is a mess, and this guy just got even more aggressive. That's because his teammate is dead. I'm on my way to you." The clone didn't say anything else, but Percy felt the urgency on the other side of the cords. Pushing his new technique to its limit, his surroundings turned into a blur again, as his muscles ached and his bones creaked. Suffice to say, taking down the air mage had taken a lot out of him. Right now, his body practically begged him to take a break, a moment at the very least, but preferably a few hours. Yet he didn't care, knowing his friend's life was hanging by a thread. Given his speed, reaching the other side of the battlefield couldn't have taken more than a few seconds, but to him they felt like an eternity. Only once the others appeared in his vision did he slow down, allowing the colors in his surroundings to settle into place once more. Scanning the battlefield, he quickly identified both his opponent and his familiar. The former was only protected by a single azure ring this time, probably having realized that Mickey wouldn't have an easy time landing a hit as long as he was kept at a distance. The rest of his mana took the form of 6 colossal serpents, currently in the process of harassing the crow. Mickey himself was a bloody mess. Several large holes marred his wings, some of his broken bones even sticking out, stabbing through both his torn flesh and his dirted plumage. It was a miracle the bird had even stayed airborne. He had his air mana to thank for that, most likely. The sight caused Percy's blood to boil, his gaze growing colder. Looking at the water mage again, he gripped his scythes more tightly. "You'll pay for that, you bastard." Percy was about to attack the water mage when the latter retracted the azure serpents of his own volition. The constructs fused into the ring coiling around his body, soon expanding to form a large bubble a dozen meters wide, the man floating inside. Next, 7 serpentine heads sprouted from the sphere, They looked similar to before, but they were much shorter, and they were attached to their caster. Percy didn't doubt that they were just as deadly, but he struggled to understand how the old man hoped to reach him or Mickey from that distance. Is he giving up? Mickey asked through their cord for the first time since the start of the battle. His voice sounded strained. Percy raised an eyebrow, also surprised by the water mage's actions. But he didn't get a chance to respond to his familiar, his opponent beating him to it. We approached you two prepared for a tough fight, but it appears we still underestimated you. To think you managed to kill old Basayan, the veteran mage said, his words crisp and clear as they reverberated through the hydra-shaped construct. Next, he sighed, losing himself in melancholy for a few seconds before continuing. It really is a pity that such a talented young man has to die. But that's just how things go, I suppose. Percy frowned, struggling to make sense of this. How was his opponent planning to take them down while hiding in that shell of his? Mickey wasn't in the best state right now, but his life wasn't in any danger. And even like this, both Percy and Mickey were much faster than him. If they wanted to escape, he wouldn't be able to stop them. Yet, his eyes widened a moment later as the realization hit him. He's not giving up, just changing tactics. It was true that the water mage wasn't in any position to kill them immediately, but he didn't have to do that. Mickey would have a harder time flying like this, and he might have to take a break sooner or later. Even Percy would have to deactivate his boosting art at some point, his body already strained from overuse. Their opponent traveled much more slowly than either of them, but he was also in a much better condition. Worse still, he had the means to track them down. He could take his sweet time chasing them, attacking when they least expected it. Even if they managed to evade him for a while, he could just put pressure on them while waiting for reinforcements. Eventually, more nobles from the Root or other houses would arrive, looking for Percy and Mickey. This guy could just join forces with them when that happened, borrowing their strength while lending them his tracking ability. How troublesome! These old blues are so annoying to deal with. Percy clicked his tongue before explaining his reasoning to Mickey. He and his familiar had spent the whole battle dancing like mice in their opponent's palms. There was simply no comparing the old foxes to the likes of Acton or Femel. It wasn't just about raw power either. Granted, the two blues had that in spades too, but their ability to pull one trick after another from a seemingly bottomless sack was far more irritating. Even though Percy had taken down one of them, it didn't feel like he had won. We can't have that. This guy needs to die here, Mickey replied, echoing the sentiment. Percy nodded grimly, knowing his familiar was right, but it was easier said than done. Can you break through the constructs? Because I sure can't. Over the course of their conversation, he had tried to penetrate the water mage's defenses, but, just like before, his scythes had failed to pierce into the domain-infused liquid. His only hope was Mickey's rending tornado. Taking advantage of the crow's greatest weapon, his body, and fueled by every drop of mana in his cores, it certainly packed much more of a punch than Percy's scythes. This was why he had asked the bird to try his luck against the water mage in the first place. Judging from the man's unblemished clothes and Mickey's sorry state, however, it didn't seem the crow had been particularly successful. I can, and I have, Mickey said, lighting up a spark of hope in Percy's eyes. But I've only managed to break through a couple of serpents at once, and he never let me get anywhere close to his body. Percy scratched his chin, contemplating his friend's words. Smashing through 2 or 3 of the constructs was a promising start, but they wouldn't win unless Mickey pierced through all of them. That said, things weren't that bad. Mickey had previously been cautious not to consume too much mana in a single attack. With Percy having his back, the crow would finally be free to go all out. But even if he managed to peel the man's defenses off, Percy might fail to land the finishing blow on their target. And both he and his familiar would be vulnerable after their attempt. As I see it, we have 2 options, he said after a while. If you're confident that you can open the way for me, I'll do my best to kill him. But if we fail, we'll just make our situation worse. Alternatively, we can just fly away now and deal with the consequences later. Both choices were risky, so Percy figured he should let his familiar and his clone discuss this first. The two understood Mickey's capabilities better than he did, having tested them against the water mage extensively already. The author's content has been appropriated. Report any instances of this story on Amazon. I'll do it. Just make sure you time your attack properly, Mickey said after a while, already gathering his strength. The glowing lines on his plumage shone even more brightly as he pushed his boosting art to its limits. His feathers lit up too, the mutated ones, at least as ice mana gathered around them. Transparent blood that looked like water gushed out of the holes in his body, but much of it froze on the spot, rapidly encasing his wounds in crystalline patches. His joints made popping sounds as he increased the frequency of his flaps, ignoring his broken bones as they shredded his flesh. Finally, mana poured out of both cores, enveloping Mickey in a thick pale mist, his muscles swelling with strength. Throughout this whole thing, the water mage didn't do much. He probably understood that his best bet was to endure this one attack with everything he had. The serpentine necks coiled around the azure bubble a couple more times, the heads retracting even closer to his body. They opened their mouths, hissing quietly as they bared their long fangs at Percy and Mickey. Percy didn't remain idle either. He created as many scythes as he could, spreading them all over the battlefield. He didn't know which ones he would end up using as weapons, and which he would turn into platforms to step on. In fact, most would probably go to waste, but he wanted to give himself as many options as possible. He'd only kept a certain area clear of his weapons, a straight line connecting Mickey to their opponent, careful not to obstruct his friend's path. Before long, the crow was done with his preparations. With no warning, he dove right toward the water mage, rotating both his body and the mana around him as he picked up speed. Violent gusts of pale wind formed, though the attack looked quite different from the last time Mickey went all out. He was a lot larger, and his mutations now covered an even greater proportion of his body. His cores had both advanced, he had upgraded his affinity, and he'd even spent a lot of time mastering circulation. Finally, he had a clone to help him. The frigid tornado spiraling toward their opponent admittedly made for a pretty sight, but Percy knew he didn't have time to marvel at it. Leaping from platform to platform, he accelerated too, preparing his one attack. It already sucked that Mickey had to put his body through the meat grinder to give him this chance, so he refused to waste it. Soon, the crow reached the first of the azure constructs. It was impossible to make the bird's features out amidst the raging storm of mana. Yet, his offensive power wasn't a joke. He dug through the water serpent with ease, the construct shattering into powder after freezing and turning brittle by the spell. The water mage didn't wait for Mickey to break through his defenses. The second and third serpents bit back at the crow. He still managed to break through both in the end, but Percy hadn't missed the wave of agony pouring through the cords, the curved fangs having inflicted new wounds on the crow's mangled body. Gritting his teeth, he continued to bounce from scythe to scythe, his surroundings turning into a blur again as he prepared for his short window of opportunity. Mickey dismantled the constructs one after another, smashing through reptilian heads and serpentine necks alike. He ignored his worsening injuries and the inevitable pain they caused, inching closer and closer to his target with each violent revolution of his body. At the same time, the screen of mana around him kept thinning. He appeared to slow down too, rapidly burning through the spell's power. At least, that was what Percy figured was happening, based on the fleeting glimpses that he caught. But it was too late for them to back down now. They both knew that. Eventually, Mickey made it all the way through. The man had shifted within his bubble at the last second, narrowly avoiding getting torn to pieces. But the entire construct was in tatters, blobs of water and shards of broken ice crumbling around him. Percy couldn't make out his expression, but he could tell based on the erratic flares of his soul that receiving such a massive blow to his willpower at once hadn't been easy. Not wasting any time, Percy took one of the quickest routes to his opponent, closing the gap separating them in an instant. Just when he was about to connect, he noticed the water mage preparing what he assumed was another of those domain blasts. He didn't panic, however, having expected it. Diverting his path to the nearest platform, he dodged the invisible projectile. Unwilling to get tricked again, He took a moment to ensure his opponent had actually released one this time, while also keeping his eyes open for the follow-up. Sure enough, the man tried to stop Percy's movements 4 times in total, mixing real shots with feints. Fully leveraging both the true power of his sneak attacks and the threat that they posed, he bought as much time as he could for the water around him to restore the Hydra to its previous shape. In the end, he just about managed to keep Percy at bay long enough to recover his construct. Unfortunately, every time Percy paused, he needed a couple of additional jumps to build up the lost speed again, and his opponent had taken advantage of that to delay him. But it didn't matter. "Nice try," Percy said, not falling for the man's ruse. The water mage winced, his eyes widening as he noticed 2 curved blades sticking out of his chest. Ever since he first formed the Hydra, the man had fully retracted his domain from the battlefield and infused it to his constructs. As a result, Percy had had a tough time telling when the willpower in the water was exhausted. If it hadn't been for his experience fighting the air mage, he might have fallen for his opponent's bluff. Luckily, he understood by now how costly those invisible blasts were. The old fox might have rebuilt his Hydra, but his domain would take a bit longer to recover, and regular water couldn't possibly block Percy's incorporeal weapons. Slicing through his opponent's soul for good measure, Percy looted the spatial amulet from the man's neck, before allowing him to plummet to the forest below. Such a pity to waste 2 blue cores. It was a rare treat for Mickey, though Percy expected it to grow more common in the coming days. Unfortunately, he didn't know how long it would take for the Patriarch's mark to fade from his familiar's body, and he'd rather not risk adding another 2. Oblivious to his thoughts, Mickey flew right under Percy, allowing him to land on his back. Checking the bird's status, Percy sent his familiar a mental message, announcing his latest spell upgrade. Of course, neither of them had the energy to celebrate, but that was probably all the more reason to do it. "Congratulations! Your spell has evolved. Wild Art. Rending Tornado, Refined - Wild Art. Freezing Tornado, Refined." The crow didn't say anything, though Percy noticed a wave of contentment seeping through the cord. Gathering as much strength as he could muster, Mickey flapped his tattered wings, carrying them both away. At the same time, the countless scythes still flying around the battlefield exploded in unison, a cloud of gray dust scattering in the wind as Percy and Mickey disappeared into the distance. The metallic bars bent and groaned, as Deimos violently slammed the door behind him. He just about managed to restrain himself too, otherwise it would have easily come off its hinges, and he didn't feel like having it replaced again. Stubborn old fool. Even after spending years inside the dark cell, Orin still refused to reveal the missing ingredient. Despite having been robbed of his freedom, his status, and even his dignity, the alchemist insisted that he had given his word to his mentee to keep the recipe to himself for 20 years. It didn't help that Deimos had to be careful not to kill the blue by accident. Unless they captured Percy or figured out the Aurora Dew by themselves, Orin was quite literally the only person on Remir who knew the secret for sure. There might be others, like Nesha, but it wasn't a certainty, and the girl was still in hiding anyway. Of course, waiting for another 16 years wasn't ideal, but the situation made the carrot a more preferable approach than the stick. Deimos had offered the alchemist several deals, each more generous than the last. To pardon his crimes, to restore his status as a senior alchemist, and even to promote him to the position of the 6th elder of the guild, despite him being a mere blue. Yet, no matter what he had put on the table, the man hadn't budged, prioritizing his promise to his student above all else. How ridiculous! Shaking his head, Deimos walked through the dim corridor, hoping he'd have better luck with the other prisoner. Though he wouldn't get his hopes up. Picking the right key from his pocket was easy. He had long learned to identify each of them by touch, after all the times he had visited the 2 captives. Twisting it inside the lock, he waited for the mechanism to click before stepping into the damp cell. Raising his left hand, he allowed some lightning mana to crackle in his palm, illuminating the place. The prisoner was sitting cross-legged on the ground, topless and barefoot, wearing nothing but a pair of shorts full of holes and covered in mud and caked blood. The man appeared to be in his late 20s, despite having lived dozens of times longer. His eyes were closed, and his expression peaceful. His beard was messy, as was his dark hair. Much of it was draped over his face, painting a stark contrast against the shaved scalp he'd sported back when he first surrendered himself to Deimos. He didn't seem bothered by the countless scars, scorch marks and wounds marring his body, many of the more recent ones still bleeding. Given his grade and his affinity, he could have healed everything within minutes, if only his mana hadn't been sealed. In fact, everyone was aware that he was staying here voluntarily. The enchanted shackles on his wrists and ankles wouldn't last long if he genuinely tried to break out. Runecrafting on Remir wasn't that bad. It was generally considered average among similarly developed worlds. But it wasn't particularly outstanding either. Even the White Corps in charge of House Etna would have been hard-pressed to design a prison capable of holding a violet against his wishes. Hephaestus was possibly the only one on Remir skilled enough to accomplish that, but this matter was way beneath the gods' pay grade. Besides, it wasn't every day that the leader of a noble house had to be kept captive. Typically, such figures would be executed on the spot, should they be unlucky enough to lose a war against a rival family. As for the cells the Alchemists Guild possessed, they weren't meant to hold such powerful mages. They were only here to discipline yellows or greens when they broke a rule. Well, it doesn't matter. He knows better than to resist. Archibald had only surrendered to spare his family the consequences of his grandson's actions. Whether he was truly innocent, as he claimed, or not, he understood his hands were tied both literally and figuratively. Seeing that the man refused to even acknowledge his presence, Deimos spoke first. "They finally found your grandson." "Well, sort of." No response. Deimos had to admit, Archibald was good. No matter what he said or did, what he threatened or offered, the old Violet never strayed even an inch from his script. He refused to admit that he cared for the boy, or that he'd known anything about Percy's involvement with the elixirs. Apparently, he's kept himself busy over the years. He snuck into the Thirsty Valley and murdered 2 holy children. All of their guards, anywhere from 10 to 15 of them. He was last spotted flying north atop a giant, 2-cornered crow. The author's tale has been misappropriated. Report any instances of this story on Amazon. This time, Archibald finally opened his eyes, raising an eyebrow. Deimos didn't doubt the man's genuine shock, innocent or not. It really was quite unbelievable after all. "I suppose you're here to free me then?" the Violet suddenly asked, his voice hoarse but even. "Free you? Why the hell would I do that?" Deimos asked. Archibald shrugged. "Didn't you lock me up because you assumed that Percy needed outside help to escape from your subordinate? If what you're saying is true, him killing a green doesn't sound so far-fetched now, does it?" Deimos chuckled. "I hate to disappoint you, but you aren't going anywhere. Not until you give me something useful. An admission of guilt, your grandson's location, or the recipe. I don't even care what at this point. But I won't let you or your family continue to mock me." Archibald just looked at him in silence, feeling slightly uncomfortable under the Violet's gaze. Deimos continued. "Nothing? Be glad I haven't implicated your family yet, but don't assume things will stay that way. In fact, I might not even have to do anything. The neighboring houses might get to them first. 2 years without a Violet is a long time." The Life Mage sighed. "Why are you here, Deimos? If you're going to torture or kill me, just get on with it already. Haven't you grown tired of wasting your breath? I'm here to make a deal. This won't end well for any of you, Archibald. Not for you, not for your grandson, and not for your house. They'll catch him sooner or later, and it'll be too late for you when that happens. Why don't you just try to salvage what you can?" Archibald shook his head. "I've already told you everything I know. That won't change, no matter how you ask or what you offer." Hearing him insist on the same old story, Deimos turned around, closing the door as he left the cell. He didn't even lash out this time, feeling more tired than angry. He knew Archibald was lying, of course. Of that, there was no doubt. Not that there was any hole in the man's words. If anything, it was impressive how consistent the Violet had been over the years, repeating the same lines after countless months of constant interrogation. He'd certainly done an admirable job controlling his expression too, always keeping the mask of the detached patriarch on, ignorant and innocent of his descendants' crimes. But there was a clue that Deimos hadn't missed. Something that had been painfully obvious since the very first day they had talked. Anybody else might not have noticed it. It was an emotion, hidden deep inside the man's gaze. It flashed brightly every time Percy's name came up. To Deimos, it was clear like the sun. Why? Because this was an emotion he had longed to see in his father's eyes his whole life. Hermes had never once looked at Deimos like that, and it killed him to see that emotion somewhere else. It was pride. As early as a few days ago, Hermes had personally contacted a few select people, announcing the news on Percy. This time, the god hadn't wanted to raise a big fuss, so he'd only told the leaders of the great houses and Deimos, who was in charge of the investigation on the Aurora Dew. At first, Deimos had expected his father to punish him over his repeated failures. He'd been in the guild for around 4 years, with nothing but a dead subordinate to show for it. To his shock, and to his great relief, that hadn't happened. Somehow, the god's demeanor had hurt Deimos even more, however. Hermes hadn't even bothered to visit him in person. He had merely relayed the same message to both himself and the others, his voice sounding cold and uncaring. Only pity. After telling them about Percy's exploits, Hermes hadn't even ordered them to hunt the Redborn down. It didn't seem like he even cared whether they did. In the end, they'd all assumed they were supposed to, because why else would he have given them Percy's physical description? Still, something about this had rubbed Deimos the wrong way. It was almost like the god had no expectations for any of them, as if he was simply going through the motions, having given up on their mission entirely, as if their failure was already set in stone. And it irked Deimos to no end. Why did the gods not involve themselves directly, even after all this time? He couldn't understand it. Why had they stopped caring about the Aurora Dew all of a sudden? After all the years he had wasted stressing over it. Did they no longer want their Yellowborns to attain divinity? What about their Greenborns? Did they not care that 2 of them had died? That their murderer was out there, spitting in the Order's face time after time? Well, I do. Deimos didn't care about the Order's image exactly, nor did he care about Remir as a whole. But he did want to get his hands on the Aurora Dew. He was a Yellowborn, after all, and a talented one at that. His father might have treated him like a worthless pawn his whole life, but things didn't have to stay that way. With the miraculous elixirs, he had a real chance to become a god. Naturally, it would take several millennia, but at least the door was open. As for the god's wishes, well, he had no idea what they had in mind. Perhaps a few years meant nothing to them, and they were happy waiting for Orin to reveal the recipe. Or maybe they had figured it out on their own already, and they no longer cared about the culprit. Yet it didn't matter. Thinking back to the disrespectful runt who had wasted so much of his time, he smirked. Whether they cared or not, the gods hadn't forbidden him from hunting Percy down either, so he was free to press on with his mission. Next, he glanced back at the cells behind him, thinking about the stubborn prisoners covering for their protégé. They might have refused to talk, but that didn't mean they were entirely useless. I wonder if he cares about you too as much as you care about him. There. Looks like a decent spot. Mickey descended to the tundra below them, landing behind a small hill. They could have probably hidden themselves better in the forest, but it would have made it harder for them to detect a potential ambush too. Besides, they'd wanted to put some distance from the location where they'd killed the Blues, in case their opponents had informed others of their whereabouts. As soon as he set foot on the ground, Mickey finally deactivated his boosting art. Percy leapt off his familiar's back promptly, unwilling to burden him any longer than he had to. Given the crow's injuries, he would have loved to have carried him instead, but he knew it would have been slower and more awkward due to the size difference. Unclogging their connection, Percy allowed his friend's feelings to seep through the cord, trying to get a better sense of his injuries. He wasn't looking forward to experiencing the crow's pain, but this would be faster than manually examining all the wounds one by one. Bracing himself for something quite unpleasant, he was a little surprised to realize that it didn't hurt that much. What the hell? I can literally see some of your bones sticking out. Shouldn't it sting more? Mickey shrugged. It was worse when we received the injuries, but still better than you'd think. And the situation has improved even more since then. Percy was happy to hear his friend hadn't suffered that much. Still, this was strange, to say the least. Well, whatever. Let's treat the most serious wounds first. We'll figure it out later. His healing potions wouldn't be very effective on a green, but beasts recovered a lot faster than humans, merely by eating a few meals. Suffice to say, Percy wasn't too worried about Mickey. They just had to set all the displaced bones properly to make sure they healed correctly. Over the next couple of hours, Percy methodically scanned the crow's body, snapping the broken bones back in place one after the other. Many of the wounds had already begun to close, so he was forced to reopen some of them, which did hurt quite a bit. However, there was something else he noticed while he did that, something that might explain why Mickey wasn't in as much pain as they would have expected. Is it me? Or did all the holes in your body get filled with ice? Back when Mickey unleashed all his mana against their opponent, Percy hadn't missed the ice spilling into his wounds. At the time, he'd assumed it was just a side effect of Mickey's latest spell. Upon further examination, the crystalline patches appeared both more extensive and more purposeful than that. The ice only covered the interior of the crow's wounds, not a single flake sticking out. It was as if some invisible law had forced the material to replace just the crow's missing flesh, and nothing more. You're right. Is this what's numbing my pain? Returning the last displaced bone to its rightful place, Percy fed Mickey a handful of healing potions to stop his bleeding, before investigating the frozen patches again. This time, he focused on them more carefully, using his mutated eyes to read the mana flow beneath the surface. I think it does more than that. There's a lot of ice mana there, but that's just the start. The beast and water mana in your bloodstream are circulating through the frozen patches too. It's almost like the ice has grown its own veins and arteries, connecting with the ones on your flesh. Can you try activating circulation again? Mickey acquiesced, the 4 sets of glowing lines appearing on his plumage once more. This time, Percy keenly noticed that they passed through the frozen patches too, treating them like regular body parts. Ignoring the cold, Percy traced his fingers on the ice. It didn't feel as smooth as he would have expected. It was rough, densely covered in tiny barbs. Examining the surface of the patches a bit more, he saw tiny amounts of air and soul mana gathering on the tips of the barbs, in a rather familiar ratio. What the hell? Mickey, I think you're growing new feathers made of ice. Listening to Percy, Mickey lifted his left talon a few inches off the ground, drawing Percy's attention. The crow was missing its rightmost digit, having lost it during the fight. A chunk of ice was covering the stump, though Percy could swear it had grown a little since the end of the battle. It had already extended past where the joint was supposed to be. Mickey held the talon in that spot for a few seconds, apparently trying something. At first, nothing happened, but Percy heard some cracking sounds at some point. Letting his senses blend with his familiars, he soon realized what the crow was trying to do. Sure enough, they both felt the joint budge after a while, the frozen tip of the stump wiggling slightly. Unauthorized use of content. If you find this story on Amazon, report the violation. Not missing a beat, Percy pulled up Mickey's status, having a pretty good idea about what was happening. Undersir. Mictlantecuhtli, Percival's familiar. Mana cores. A mana core 1 green, beast. A mana core 2 yellow, ice. Mutations. A soul predator. Allows one to more easily interact with the souls of others. Wind dancer. Allows one to augment their flight using air mana. Thin blood. Allows one to survive on fewer nutrients. Ice sculpture. Allows one to replace missing body parts with functional chunks of ice. Spectral traits. Weaving boosts one's proclivity in manipulating one-dimensional structures. Insomnia. Eliminates the need for sleep. Spells. Wild art. Regulation, refined. Wild art. Freezing tornado, refined. Frozen shards, refined. Circulation, refined. Decrees. Morai's decree grants a second mana core. Undersir. Amazing. he spat, before sharing the images with Mickey. They both ignored the obvious changes in the crow's spell section, focusing on the fourth trait. The question marks had finally been replaced by actual text, confirming Percy's suspicions. Do you think the wounds will close properly after a while? Or am I stuck like this? Mickey asked. Does it feel worse than your flesh? Percy asked back. Strangely, no. Mickey shrugged. The spots that have fully closed feel exactly the same. I bet I won't even notice the difference once the new feathers and the missing digit are back. Still, it's a bit weird to be literally made of ice. Percy nodded, not disagreeing with his familiar's assessment. At least, he couldn't imagine having his own hand suddenly replaced by ice, no matter how natural it felt. It would definitely take Mickey some time to get used to this, if he ever did. Well, if it doesn't heal by itself, we can look for a life mage to do it for you, he said. Surely, if they were to forcefully carve the ice out and flood the surrounding flesh with life mana, it would close properly. This was still a good thing in the short term. At the rate Mickey's injuries were healing, he would be back in fighting condition by tomorrow. And if they got lucky, the ice patches would consume even fewer nutrients than regular flesh. I wonder if every beast with a second core and a composite affinity can mutate like this. Maybe not. Ice was quite unique even among composite affinities. Between ice mana itself and its components, Mickey had all the ingredients to reproduce both the solids and liquids in his body. The only other affinities Percy thought might work like this were mud and lava. Actually, I think the fact that Mickey is a familiar might have also played a role. Percy hadn't missed the silver tint on the frozen body parts, indicating that the soul predator mutation had also interfaced with the new one, breathing life into the inanimate material. Perhaps, this wouldn't have been possible if Mickey's soul wasn't as flexible and partially foreign to his body as it was. In fact, his thin blood mutation, which came from his water affinity, had likely also helped. Lava was made of fire and earth, and Percy had no idea what mutations those affinities might produce. There was a good chance that only ice and mud familiars could accomplish something similar. In any case, this was good news. Percy wasn't sure whether Mickey would grow comfortable with the new body parts anytime soon, but even if he didn't, it was bound to be better than his hunger coming back. If the new mutation truly allowed him to sustain himself more easily, it might be a good trade-off regardless. What were the odds of his wasp familiar getting an ice or mud affinity too? Probably not high. Shaking the pointless thoughts away, he turned back to his friend. For now, try to use regulation with the ice patches. It should let you recover your stamina even faster. Obviously, you won't be able to do it once your flesh regrows, but there's no reason not to take advantage of this while it lasts. Mickey nodded, before thinking of something else. What do you think the limit of this mutation is? Limit? Well, it says missing body parts, but it doesn't really specify which ones can be replaced, or whether there is a maximum volume of ice I can sustain at once. Do you think it could replace an entire wing? Or my heart? That's actually a good question, Percy said, scratching the back of his head. Well, I doubt it can replace your cores. I've no idea how they work exactly, but I would be shocked if you could recreate them by hollowing out a piece of ice. As for the rest of your body, let's hope we never find out. Based on what they'd seen so far, most of Mickey's body should be eligible for replacement. Even his wings consisted mainly of blood, muscles, bones, and feathers, all of which had already been replaced elsewhere, to smaller extents. Even his heart was essentially just a muscle, so Percy wouldn't be shocked if Mickey could replace it too. But he didn't know about the rest of his organs. Certainly not his brain. And this wasn't something he was willing to put to the test. At any rate, Mickey should be able to fly again, and they'd rather not spend too long here. The more distance they put between themselves and their recent battlefield, the safer they would feel. Hopping onto his familiar's back, Percy was about to ask him to take off, when he noticed something shooting straight at him at a tremendous speed. He was about to roll out of the way, but he caught himself at the last second, realizing this wasn't anything to be wary of. In fact, he might have noticed this sooner, if he hadn't been so busy dealing with Mickey's situation. One of his clones was back. In the end, The most recent clone hadn't brought anything particularly interesting back. Having spent most of his time looking for and failing to find a sapient green host, he'd possessed a beast instead. Percy had found himself in the body of an avian creature that had looked a bit like a four-winged bat. He had searched for signs of civilization or rare herbs, only to come up empty-winged. Eventually, he had been forced to deem the trip a failure, returning home to try again. The good news was that the clone hadn't brought many memories back either, so assimilating his experiences hadn't been particularly difficult. Half an hour later, Percy had sent a new clone outside, before resuming work on his projects. Both his and Mickey's recoveries were coming along nicely. The crow's missing body parts had mostly been replaced by chunks of ice already, so he only had to deal with a minor stamina problem. Even with his mutations and his spells alleviating the bulk of his hunger, the fight against the blues had taken a lot out of him. They didn't stop flying, fully aware that they needed to stay on the move as much as possible. However, they did take things easy for the next couple of days. Mickey kept himself busy applying regulation to his new mutation, as well as scouring the wilderness for the occasional yellow beast to munch on, all in an attempt to rebuild his reserves as soon as possible. Meanwhile, Percy split his time between perfecting his mana threads and brewing some Aurora Dew to extend his stash. Both tasks were challenging to do while airborne, but he was getting better at them by the hour. They didn't practice their coordination, nor anything else related to combat, however. Directly increasing their strength was definitely high on their list of priorities. The difficult battle they just barely survived had been quite an eye-opener. Still, they figured they should wait until they recovered completely before exerting themselves. Eventually, a second clone arrived, and this one proved a lot more successful than his predecessor. Burrowing in Percy's body, the gray wisp dumped yet another strange object in his soul. Unlike the black, disc-shaped seal he had purchased from Metatron, this one sported a deep red color and was shaped like a pyramid. Through his clone's memories, he understood this was actually a tiny piece of a goddess's internal world. It contained not only her own soul, but also the souls of hundreds of her mortal subjects. They were all sleeping soundly inside the structure, floating next to his storage seal. What's left of them, anyway? Goddess or not, Nephthys had been forced to brutally mutilate her soul, her mind and her internal world, as well as those of her people. It was the only way Percy could have possibly carried them back to Remir. He still had no idea if any of them would ever recover, but he'd already promised her to try and help them. That said, he wasn't going to half-ass things when dealing with an entity that had lived for hundreds of thousands of years. Certainly not one with the mind affinity. Turning to the other former deity, the one resting around his finger, he tried to make sense of Nephthys' circumstances. "Wow, you've got quite a knack for getting into trouble," Zoras mused after hearing Percy's explanation. "Do you think that she might have brainwashed or manipulated me in any way?" The irony of voicing this question to the same person whose own integrity he had doubted just over a year ago wasn't lost on him. But Nesha had already confirmed that Zoras had been honest with him, and that he didn't harbor any ill intentions. In his girlfriend's absence, the former god was his best shot at vetting the goddess's words. Granted, with a clone inside Nesha's body, he currently had access to her Truthseeker bloodline. The problem was that he'd need a direct line from the clone to the goddess, as having his main body relay their words wouldn't work. Worse still, Nephthys was currently asleep, and would likely remain so for the foreseeable future. "I doubt it," Zoras said, before elaborating. "Messing with your senses, sure. She could have shown you whatever she wanted inside her internal world. But even if she did, she shouldn't have the means to hijack your main body after the fact. Certainly not in her current state. Did you know this text is from a different site? Read the official version to support the creator." "What about messing with my thoughts or memories?" Percy asked again. Zoras mentally shook his head. "I don't know what today's gods are capable of. I've been out of the loop since before this woman was born. But true mind control goes a lot deeper than merely affecting what one sees or hears. To put this into context, let me give you an analogy regarding life magic. Altering your senses would be the mental equivalent of infecting or curing your body of a disease. A rather simple thing that even a violet or a white can do. Affecting your thoughts and memories, on the other hand, would be closer to giving somebody a bloodline. I'm sure you know enough about bloodlines by now to understand how much harder that would be to pull off. Percy nodded, the former god's words being in line with what Metatron had told him. And you're confident there aren't any gods who can do that? I didn't say that. In fact, there used to be one back when I was still active. His name was Baphomet, and he hailed from the world of Cat-Horus, a rather high-ranking greater spring. But even he couldn't do this by himself. What do you mean? He had cultivated a special order of mortals to help him. Over 100 yellowborns and greenborns, ranging from violets to demigods. And they all had the mind affinity. They amplified his strength, allowing him to seize another's mind entirely. He could even do it from afar, manipulating somebody from across worlds. Percy swallowed hard, imagining himself getting targeted by this spell. He'd lose control of his body in an instant, probably not even realizing what had happened to him. At least, he didn't think he had the means to defend himself against such a powerful mental attack. Can it affect gods as well? Thankfully, no. Even a strong mortal with a mind affinity might be able to do something about it if they noticed it in time. But don't underestimate how much damage he could still cause to a rival faction. Imagine one of the strongest demigods on your world suddenly falling in the hands of a hostile god. There's no telling what Baphomet might use them for. Zora's words sent a chill down Percy's spine. You think he's still around? Or that there might be others like him nowadays? I wouldn't be surprised if he's alive. Even the largest factions avoided messing with Cat-Horus. It just wasn't worth the hassle of making such a troublesome enemy. But I also doubt there are others like him. It's not an easy spell to pull off. It takes a very talented god to serve as the core of the array, and that's not even the hardest bit. The mortals, Percy guessed. Indeed. He needs to keep finding and training more of them every few thousand years. Even for a greater spring that owns several planets, gathering so many powerful mind users all the time isn't easy. This is just my personal guess, but I wouldn't be surprised if they own the elemental source for the mind affinity. Percy exhaled in relief upon hearing that. He still made a mental note to stay clear of Cat-Horus for the foreseeable future. He didn't doubt it would be full of amazing treasures, but it wasn't worth the risk. Not when there were hundreds of other greater springs he had yet to explore. So, what's the worst thing Nephthys can do to me? I admit, I'm still a little nervous to have a mind goddess sleeping inside my soul. The first thing you need to remember is, that thing inside you is not a goddess. Not anymore. The fact that she managed to set foot on Remir is proof enough that she can no longer be considered one. Zoras sighed at that, probably comparing her to his own situation. Percy didn't say anything, waiting for him to continue. Anyway, that's not to say that everything she told you was the truth. She could have still lied or held something back. The good old way. Percy nodded, knowing that his only options were to either trust her based on the limited information he had available, or to break his promise to her and let the Amenthei perish. At least, I don't think she lied about the condition of her people. Percy had clearly seen the poor state of their souls before entering her internal world. There were only a few of them left, and they were all dying slowly. That much he didn't think she could have faked. Of course, she could have still twisted the truth in all sorts of ways when showing him her world's past. He sighed, blindly believing someone he had just met wasn't ideal, but he didn't want to doom an entire race of people due to his suspicions. This was why he had agreed to her terms in the first place. And she clearly understood that too, which was why she'd placed her hopes on him. Well, what's done is done. I just hope this thing lasts long enough. Examining the pyramid again, Percy noticed it was rising through his soul, slowly making its way to his head. The object's properties felt a little contradictory. On one hand, it was extremely light, probably thanks to Nephthys' efforts to help him carry it home. On the other, it felt exceptionally hard. Apparently, even the tiniest sliver of a deity's soul wasn't the kind of thing Percy could damage easily with his current means. I bet I wouldn't be able to leave a scratch on the pyramid even if I went all out. Of course, that didn't mean he was powerless to deal with the object. The structure could only exist under the protection of its owner's soul, which, in turn, could only survive within Percy's. If he wanted to harm Nephthys or her people, he could easily expel the pyramid from his body and watch it crumble away in no time. Obviously, he had no intention of doing anything of the sort, but knowing he held all the power in this situation went a long way toward proving Nephthys' sincerity and desperation. Finally, there was another thing he'd noticed as soon as the object had entered his soul. Something that caused the corner of his lips to curl up, filling him with greed. Whether she lied to me or not, at least I won't end up empty-handed. As soon as the object entered Percy's soul, ideas had started sprouting in his mind one after the other. The effect had initially been weaker than the Wiseman's dust, but this was rapidly changing as the pyramid rose closer and closer to his head. By the time it reached his brain, or at least the part of his soul resting inside it, and once he resumed working on his spells, Percy was confident the effect would far surpass it. After all, he currently had a lot more of it in his possession than he'd had on Felmara, and his connection to the substance was far more intimate too. "Do you think it's safe to use?" he asked Zoras, still trying to wrap his head around the goddess's intentions. "Absolutely. Mental and spectral versions of the Wiseman's dust are well documented, though most factions haven't bothered to give them a different name. Even for gods without a mind or soul affinity, there are several ways to collect and disseminate it. The fact that she still has hers so many years after her ascension only lends credence to her story. It'll be a huge help to you, so make the most of it while it lasts." Percy nodded. He knew he wouldn't be able to use up the entire stash in the limited time that he had. Sadly, he'd somehow managed to place himself under another strict deadline. Originally, he had intended to take his sweet time infiltrating the fungal spire. Due to Nephthys' situation, he'd have to greatly expedite his plans, however, getting his hands on a wasp egg within the next couple of years. It was either that or placing her soul in a different body, which wouldn't be ideal. "Mickey, have you felt any different since my clone returned?" The crow shook his head, the passenger in his body soon echoing the sentiment. Evidently, the two of them wouldn't be able to benefit from the so-called Wiseman's murmurs either. Despite their powerful connection and their close physical proximity to Percy's main body, it seemed the effect of the substance was limited to within the confines of his own soul. At least, whatever was left of it wouldn't necessarily go to waste. Once he placed Nephthys' soul inside the wasp egg, she would essentially be reborn as a mortal. The resulting familiar would inherit whatever was left of the pyramid and, by extension, the substance. Whether it retained the goddess's memories or not, the Wiseman's murmurs should help the creature with its development, allowing it to catch up to Percy and Mickey sooner. Or not. These are essentially her own impurities that she expelled during her ascension. Will they even work on her? Percy shrugged. This wasn't the kind of question anybody could answer, since he was pretty much in uncharted territory. Thinking of something else, he turned back to Zoras. "Do you have any idea why she stayed on her planet until the very end? She claimed she was stuck, but I was under the impression that gods could travel in space." "Generally speaking, they can," Zoras said before elaborating. "It's a little trickier for mind and soul gods like us though, since our internal worlds are initially incapable of housing physical objects. And one of the most important requirements to survive in space is having air to breathe." Percy raised an eyebrow, not expecting a deity to be constrained by something so mundane. "Seriously? Is there no way around that?" he asked again. Somehow, he struggled to imagine a powerful Titaness like Phoebe stranded on Remir due to her affinity. "There is," Zoras confirmed. "You can use external means like a starship or a storage device that can recycle air for you. But it doesn't sound like her people were advanced enough to build either. That said, it's possible to turn our internal world corporeal, allowing us to store air and even plants inside it. That's the most popular option, as it gives us the ability to traverse the cosmos with our own body. But it also takes some time and knowledge to get there. It's something a fledgling goddess without peers or access to the outside world would have struggled to discover by herself. The narrative has been taken without permission. Report any sightings." Percy nodded. This was pretty much in line with what Nephthys had told him. Of course, it still wasn't definitive proof that she'd been honest with him. Couldn't she have faked all of those details to trick me? Sure, but it sounds far-fetched. Why would she allow herself to get eaten by a demonic infestation if she had a way out? And why would she agree to become your familiar if it wasn't her last resort? No offense to you or your crow buddy, but I just don't see any god willingly giving up their divinity to be reborn as a low-born beast, two cores or not. Fair enough. Suffice to say, Percy was more than happy with Zorz's analysis. Obviously, even if Nephthys had told him the truth about everything, it still didn't mean that she was a good person or a suitable familiar candidate. Yet, he figured she'd at least earned herself the benefit of the doubt. Besides, I can interrogate her again with Nesh's help after she wakes up. If it turns out she's up to something, it won't be too late to take her out. Robbed of all her strength, she wouldn't be able to resist if Percy decided to kill her. Losing his wasp familiar would suck, but he could always create another one. Anyway, that's for future me to worry about. Right now, I should focus on making the most of the next 2 years. Activating his boosting art, Percy spent a few minutes mending the most recent batch of soul injuries, while sorting through the clone's memories. At the same time, he went over his ongoing projects once again, taking the new variables into account. Originally, he had intended to focus on 3 main things. The first was his newly upgraded secret art and, by extension, his collaboration with Mickey. This was something they had started working on since before leaving the Thirsty Valley. Unfortunately, they had a long way to go before they could freely share their thoughts, their senses, and possibly their mana. Next was his armor. With the murmurs helping him, he was bound to complete his mana threads in no time. However, he would have to wait for Nesha and his clone to finish reading through the runecrafting books before he could proceed with the final step. Luckily, his girlfriend had already made it back to the city safely, and she was currently trying to rebuild her life. Things were going well, but it would be months until he was done with this. Finally, there was the dance. Mickey would have a much easier time figuring it out with the clone's help, but he had anywhere from 3 to 4 versions of it that he needed to master, depending on whether the beast variant was even capable of extending outside his body. Luckily, everything would progress much faster once Elaine perfected her own version, but Percy's cousin had yet to even reach the Camelot province, so they had no choice but to wait. Percy sighed. Each of these tasks was not only time-consuming but also filled with countless hurdles. Then again, it wasn't that surprising, considering that he and his familiar were currently working on a bunch of masterful spells. At the end of the day, he'd just have to be patient and hope that they got everything done on time. He shook his head. That's still not good enough. Now that his deadline had moved up by several years, he'd have to fully take advantage of all 5 of his clones. The ones currently with his friends were already doing the best they could, but that still left 2 that he wasn't using efficiently. Percy had planned to have them look for blue hosts sooner or later, to help him in his search for the Greater Springs. Not to mention the starry commander he needed to possess to actually get his hands on the wasp egg. The problem was that creatures at such a high grade were inherently difficult to deal with, whether they were sapients or beasts. If the 2 mages he and Mickey had just taken down were anything to go by, Percy would be hard-pressed to placate a bunch of wise old monsters, let alone getting them to potentially betray their factions. Even worse, they'd all be more knowledgeable about cosmic matters, so one mistake on Percy's part could easily lead to his secrets leaking to the wrong pair of ears. Consequently, he had no choice but to take certain countermeasures before he even attempted to seek them out. Up until now, he hadn't been in a hurry to dive into all that, partly because he'd been busy with other matters, such as his escape from the valley or his training with Mickey, and partly because he was still adjusting to the constant influx of memories from all these clones. Yet, it didn't look like he had the luxury to keep wasting time. Oh well, I can just let my clones worry about this. Percy found himself inside the body of a green armadillo-esque creature. His vessel was large, round, and covered in lots of hard, chitinous plates. That said, he didn't much care about the beast's physical appearance right now. He was far more interested in his host's soul, as well as the very process of possessing it. Convincing the creature to let him in hadn't been difficult. The promise of patching its soul up and saving it from the verge of death had been alluring as always, the beast being more than smart enough to understand his intentions. But that only made him feel a little guilty over what he was about to do. Up until now, he'd always had to walk on eggshells around his hosts, because they all possessed absolute authority over their souls and bodies, and could evict him at a moment's notice if their goals didn't align. Obviously, his unique ability to save their lives gave him a lot of leverage when negotiating with them, but this advantage was ultimately constrained by their intelligence, their honesty, and their willingness to strike or uphold a deal with him. If his host would rather die than let him stay, Percy was, generally speaking, powerless to do anything about it. That was why he had asked Zorez to coach him on a few simple techniques that would help him cast a stickier vote, so to speak, moving forward. He didn't expect to reach a point where he could just disregard his host's wills entirely or seize their bodies by force, but he hoped to obtain the means to stand his ground if they tried to bully him around. "Sorry, mate. I won't let you suffer too badly. Consider it my payment for saving your life." Percy knew this wouldn't be a pleasant experience for either party, yet he also understood he needed to get some practice before he could truly add this new tool to his arsenal. Stretching his wisp, he allowed it to brush over all the cracks in the armadillo's soul, getting a feel for even the smaller ones that he hadn't bothered to fix. Instantly, he sensed his host's unease at his actions, but the creature shook its worries off, ultimately choosing to trust the person who had just saved it. Smiling bitterly at this display of undeserved trust, Percy chose a pair of cracks that crossed into one another, forming an X shape. Thinking the landscape would give him good purchase to latch onto, he turned his soul into a hand, slipping his spectral fingers into the narrow gaps. Applying some pressure, he slowly strengthened his grip on the creature. It didn't take him long to be met with some resistance, a wave of force washing over the armadillo's soul, unlodging his tendrils one after the other. Naturally, his host hadn't appreciated his forceful approach, and it was kindly warning him to stop whatever he was doing. Percy sighed. He would have asked Mickey to let him practice on him, had it been an option. Sadly, his familiar soul was way too compatible with his own. If he tried to injure the crow and inject his soul in the wounds, he wouldn't be able to separate himself later, at least, not without a ton of pain. Elaine and Nesha weren't great options either. The girls might be willing to let him experiment on them, since he wasn't planning to do anything particularly damaging. But there was another problem. His clones were supposed to stay in their bodies for several more months, so they wouldn't be able to return and bring the knowledge back to the original anytime soon. Left with no other choice, Percy doubled down on his current test. Identifying a few more cracks like the first one, he tightly grabbed against their ragged walls, careful of the amount of strength he exerted. As early as during his first meeting with Mickey, Percy had learned how easy it was to further damage an already injured soul if he wasn't careful. Luckily, he'd gained a lot of experience over the years. He understood how to tread the fine line between a grip firm enough for him to hold his ground and a touch gentle enough to preserve his host's integrity. The fact that the creature was at green and in a better condition than Mickey certainly helped too. His prospective blue hosts would be even tougher in that regard. Unauthorized duplication. This narrative has been taken without consent. Report sightings. Despite his relative finesse, Percy was still at a severe disadvantage, however. The overwhelming wave of rejection pried his ethereal digits off the armadillo's soul one after the other, slowly pushing him out of its body. The beast was clearly done playing around, having finally decided to evict its rude guest for good. "Not so fast," Percy spat. Before embarking on this quest, he had asked Zorez for tips. Obviously, the former god didn't have much experience with possessing another's soul, but he still knew a lot of nifty tricks that Percy might be able to employ. Recalling the strange state he entered whenever he used his spectral traits, he caused his wisp to transform. His soul squirmed and bubbled up, countless tiny legs sprouting all over its nebulous surface. The spider-like limbs dug into his host's soul, strengthening his grip on the hostile soil. At the same time, a series of thin hairs appeared. Flailing around for a moment, they all homed into the nearest protrusions, wrapping and coiling around them. The beast's soul thrashed about, hell-bent on getting rid of him. But Percy held his ground just as stubbornly, refusing to budge. This back and forth continued for a couple of minutes, as neither side appeared willing to compromise. That said, what Percy got out of this tussle was rather limited. While he had successfully overstayed his welcome against his host's will, his connection to the creature's mind and senses had been severed entirely. Even though the armadillo failed to shake him off, Percy still couldn't retain his access to the beast without its permission. Oh well, let's take it one step at a time. This is already good enough for the first attempt. Eventually, some of the cracks expanded. Unable to take the pressure any longer, the armadillo's condition started to worsen, the ethereal tendrils holding the preservation runes in its injuries snapping one by one. I guess that's my cue to leave. Not wanting to hurt the creature, Percy stopped fighting back. The transformed features on his wisp soon reversed, as the armadillo finally pushed him out. Technically, Percy could have stayed longer if he wanted, but he'd already gained plenty from this trip. Not that he was above killing a beast as part of his training. He'd already slaughtered hundreds during his stay in the valley, but this still felt rather icky. Healing the creature only to stab it in the back 10 minutes later just rubbed him the wrong way, so he didn't want to go too far. Besides, there were plenty of other hosts in the universe waiting for him. Finding himself inside the body of a flying beetle, Percy didn't attempt a forceful possession this time. Having a host with the ability to travel relatively quickly, he didn't want to waste it on his new project. After all, he had plenty of other goals no less important. He still tried to find a green sapient whenever possible, as the value of a lesser spring couldn't be overstated, but those were rarer. Thus, he was more than willing to spend some time doing other things whenever the situation called for it. Buzzing around the sprawling forest, Percy ignored the wildlife as he scanned his surroundings for magical herbs. Most of the creatures ran away upon noticing him, as green beasts were typically at the top of the food chain on most barren worlds. Over the next few hours, he did come across several plants rich in red or orange mana, but he wasn't interested in most of them. An orange ingredient with a rare affinity might let him invent a new potion, but there wasn't much of a point in doing that when his potions were already losing their effectiveness on him. His current priority was to find a secondary ingredient rich in gravity mana, so that he could try to register the compression principle he had read about in Nephthys Sanctuary. If and when he did that, and once he had the means to elevate all his potions and tattoos to a usable level again, he could consider branching out in more directions. As things stood, he'd rather not fill his spatial seals with junk. Of course, even if he stumbled upon the correct ingredient, it wouldn't be easy to identify its affinity. Unlike the vibrant colors that ingredients rich in karma mana tended to have, gravity mana was colorless and otherwise subtle. Without his mutated eyes to help him, Percy was forced to take a gamble on any red plant the affinity of which he couldn't immediately recognize. Storing a few specimens of each one, he hoped to examine them more closely when he returned home. There was also the question of whether he would even be able to cultivate these alien plants on Remir. The environment might not be suitable, not to mention that he was currently on the run. But even if he couldn't, just adding the new principle to his status was more than worth his time. It would boost his brewing yield and get him more aurora dew out of his supplies. Furthermore, it would enhance his eyes, hopefully helping him find other gravity ingredients more easily in the future. Searching for alchemical ingredients wasn't his only mission, however. As always, he had kept his compound eyes open for signs of civilization or another source of stable beast mana. Two things that often led to something interesting. And there was another thing, something he could work on by himself while flying. All thanks to some more helpful advice from Zoras. Holding his ground inside a hostile body wasn't the only ability Percy wanted to master before looking for a blue host. Ideally, he also wanted to learn how to hide his blessing, to avoid having to answer any difficult questions about its origin. Of course, soul affinities were rare to begin with. Even on a greater spring, most of the younger and weaker mortals might have never seen one. Blues were typically much older and enjoyed an elevated status, however, so Percy couldn't count on their inability to tell that something about his mana was amiss. Naturally, finding a ring of sacrilege wasn't the only, nor even the most common, explanation for a mortal with a blessing. That said, he'd rather not have to lie to everyone he met about being the son of a god. He had no way of knowing how they might react to such a peculiar claim. Some might grow more guarded toward him, while others might ask him follow-up questions that would inevitably expose him. No matter how he thought about it, it was just better to keep this knowledge to himself. Finally, there was Metatron. Unfortunately, the Titan was already aware that Percy didn't have any divine parents, so the lie wouldn't even work on him. In fact, he was the very person who had introduced him to the idea of acquired blessings in the first place. Naturally, Percy couldn't afford to return to the vault without first learning how to suppress his blessing. Not that he planned to go back to the artificial world anytime soon. He had already purchased all the runes he would need to upgrade his armor, and he was busy with a dozen other things at the moment. Then again, opening a portal to the vault was essentially his only way out of an impossible situation, as his trip to Felmara had already proven. He didn't want to lose access to that option entirely, just because he hadn't bothered to prepare for it. Luckily, the solution was relatively straightforward. Zoras had already taught him how to work on it. Doing so while in another's body was trickier, because he only had his limited stash of fused mana to draw from, some of which he had already spent while healing his host. It would have been much easier to try this with his main body, taking advantage of the practically limitless supply of soul mana. It can't be helped. The original has a ton of other things to worry about. It's best to have the clones pitch in with whatever they can. Grabbing a sliver of gray from his stash, Percy tried to alter its properties, to revert it to its original nature. For several minutes, perhaps even hours, nothing happened. But he didn't let that get to him, continuing to scan his surroundings for gravity ingredients as he worked on the blessing. He hadn't really expected this to work on the first try anyway. The idea behind this trick was simple enough, but it didn't mean it was going to be easy. According to Zoras, mortals were inherently ill-equipped to handle concepts. They could wield them, much like a barbarian could swing an axe around, but that didn't mean they could truly comprehend them in any deep way. After all, understanding a concept was the hallmark of divinity. As for those below that threshold, they could barely tap into the concepts they'd been lucky enough to be born with, or those they had otherwise acquired, be they the ones tied to their original affinity, ones they had obtained later in life like Mickey or their blessings. To make things worse, some concepts were even harder to grasp than others. For example, Gabe's blessing of heat was a lot simpler for anybody to wrap their minds around, as it was part of everyone's daily life. Of course, mortals would still find it impossible to comprehend it in a deep way, or to infuse it in their mana without the corresponding blessing, but its owners didn't have as difficult a time muting its effects. Unauthorized duplication. This tale has been taken without consent. Report sightings. Sadly, Percy's blessing fell on the opposite end of the spectrum. After all, he hadn't even heard of the concept of permanence until just over a year ago. Soul affinities were already relatively obscure to begin with, let alone an even more exotic variant. The good news was that he didn't need to fully understand his concept to do what he wanted. Merely suppressing it, preventing its effects from seeping into his mana, was apparently among the most basic forms of concept manipulation, much like affinity fusion and affinity fission that he was already familiar with. Recalling the former god's explanation, Percy tried to figure out what he was doing wrong. According to Zoras, these three techniques had one thing in common. They relied on the relationship between two or more concepts, using each as a focus point to move closer or farther away from. When it came to affinity fusion, one had to move from the two source elements toward a third. With affinity fission, it was the opposite. Concept suppression, on the other hand, relied on a similar yet different dynamic, as it played on the relationship between the parent concept, like fire or soul, and a derivative one, such as heat or permanence. It basically involved temporarily undoing all the changes that had occurred during the acquisition of the blessing. Actually, I should have an advantage there. Somebody like Gabe, who had been born with his blessing, had never actually experienced the default state of his element. Meanwhile, Percy had spent most of his life wielding regular soul mana, so it was a lot easier for him to differentiate the properties that had originated from the blessing from those that predated it. Approaching the task with renewed confidence, Percy attempted to cleanse his mana from the blessing's influence once more. Hours passed, and then days without much progress. Even worse, Percy's beast hosts didn't have Mickey's second core, nor his mutations. Consequently, They were all slaves to the same bottomless hunger that plagued every beast in the universe. Suffice to say, Percy had been forced to take several detours to appease his host, which greatly inhibited his ability to search for the gravity ingredients he needed. It wasn't until about a week later that he achieved any semblance of a positive result. He hadn't found many candidate plants to bring back, only a handful of different types that he didn't think stood much of a chance of possessing the right affinity. But his efforts to suppress the blessing did do something. Borrowing a pair of legs from the beetle, the creature had plenty of limbs anyway. Percy was playing with his last sliver of fused mana when it happened. The gray color brightened by a couple shades, the substance feeling slightly lighter for a moment. Of course, the change didn't last long, but this was promising. It's just one step of several though, he reminded himself, not wanting to get carried away by the first hint of success. Obviously, he would need to scale this up massively until he could fully rob his mana of its new properties. Not only that, but he had to learn how to do it passively to his entire stash and for an extended period of time. Finally, his blessing came with its own set of challenges. It wouldn't be enough for him to mask the nature of his mana, because the concept had already affected his soul as well. Somebody like Metatron might still pick up on that if he was careless. Luckily, Zoras had mentioned that he could suppress the changes to his wisps in a similar manner. It would be even harder, of course, and he'd also have to be more careful with it. If he went too far, his clones would lose their ability to support multiple spectral traits, which would have catastrophic consequences. Percy had to achieve a delicate balance between hiding away all the superficial changes to his mana and soul and retaining some of their most important functions. Mentally sighing, he withdrew his clone from the beetle's body, knowing that he wouldn't get anything else done here. Having exhausted his mana and worn the creature's patience thin, he was better off trying his luck elsewhere. Of course, he could have tried to forcefully possess the beast too, getting some practice with that, but he figured the poor thing had helped him enough already. Speeding back to Remir through the infinite realm of darkness, he couldn't help but lament how busy the following months would be. On top of having so many things for his main body to work on, his clones had somehow gotten their hands full with all sorts of side projects of their own. They had to search for gravity ingredients, master the forceful possession technique, learn to suppress the blessing, and, of course, continue his eternal search for lesser and greater springs. But it's good to be this busy, isn't it? He thought, nodding with determination. With 5 clones, a mountain of Wiseman's murmurs stored inside his main body's head, and the insomnia trait eliminating the need for sleep, anything less than this would have been a waste of his potential. Percy was sitting against the boulder, using it as cover from the howling winds. It was slanted, shielding him from the snow, though a few flakes still made their way to him every now and then. They formed 3 small mounds, one on his head, and another on each shoulder. The cold itself didn't bother him much. It would have been strange if it did, with 2 yellow cores filling him with strength. Yet, he did have to release a burst of mana every couple of minutes to shake the snow off. It was annoying, and what he was currently working on required his utmost attention. Mickey wasn't with him right now. While they had tried to remain on the move as much as possible, they'd made an exception today. After all, they hadn't seen any humans in days, and the blizzard lowered visibility even more. Percy figured they could afford to take a short break. For a couple of hours, at least. They both needed it, as the monotonous journey had started to grate on their nerves. That was not to say that they had lowered their guard, however. Mickey was flying leisurely around the mountain, scanning the frozen slopes for a quick snack or any signs of an enemy attack. In fact, Percy felt every little detail his familiar experienced. From the rush of wind pressing against his wings to the taste of iron in his beak. A few droplets of blood from Mickey's most recent meal rolled down his neck, soaking the feathers there. Percy felt the urge to gag every now and then, almost forgetting that this wasn't happening to his own body. He even heard his clone and his familiar chatting incessantly inside his head, the 2 idiots not giving a shit that he was busy with something important. They were talking about something dumb too, some kind of contest. They were taking turns controlling Mickey's body, competing to see who would hunt the most critters. Can you 2 shut up for a few minutes? I'm at a critical juncture. Two waves of annoyance seeped through the cords. The bastards had the nerve to act as if he was the one disturbing them. "Need I remind you that this was your idea?" The clone snapped back. Of course, he didn't have to voice his thoughts. Given the intimacy of their connection, Percy could easily read what was on the clone's mind, as if he'd been the one to think it. Naturally, the opposite was also true, which only made this worse. The two had clearly been aware of Percy's bubbling irritation all along. They'd just chosen to ignore him until he lashed out. "Sure," he sighed in exasperation. "But we both know you're being extra annoying on purpose." It would have arguably been more prudent of him to keep the connection blocked off for a couple more days. At least until he was done with the mana threads. However, he figured this was actually a great opportunity to practice with soul harmony. After all, sharing his mind with Mickey wasn't that hard when they were idle, but it wasn't as beneficial for them either. The whole point of the spell was to let them cooperate during a fight, so they had to learn to keep it active while doing something mentally intensive. "I'm happy to swap places with you, if you'd rather train with Mickey." Percy rolled his eyes. "You know that's not how our bloodline works." He shook his head, not saying anything else. Doing his best to ignore his irritating partners, he glanced down at the gray thread in his hands. Tugging at it a few times, he applied progressively more force, trying to gauge how strong it was. It held for a while, only snapping once he started to exert himself. This was already a little better than his regular reinforced mana, on top of being dozens of times more flexible. And he wasn't even done yet. Not only did the threads have more room for improvement, but Percy should also be able to pack them more tightly into his new armor, doing away with its previous modularity. If everything went according to plan, he would be able to fit more enchantments on it too. But that was a project for later. Let's focus on perfecting the material for now. Percy was already happy with the 6 variants of reinforced mana he'd settled on. They all looked very different from the rudimentary materials he had invented back in Bogside Town, and he'd designed each one with a very specific purpose in mind. In the end, he ditched the original forms of his soft and crystallized mana entirely, at least as far as his mana threads were concerned. The alloys he'd come up over the years were plenty to achieve his goal. Over the past week, he'd made a few last-minute modifications to his materials, improving them even further. He had the Wiseman's Murmurs to thank for that, as they filled him with new inspiration. Having settled on the final variants already, he only needed to play with the exact ratios, fine-tuning the configuration of the construct until he was happy with it. This narrative has been unlawfully taken from Novelbin. If you see it on Amazon, please report it. Taking a few handfuls of fused mana from his seal that he'd prepared beforehand, he set them on a piece of cloth by his feet. Then he grabbed a long thread from the first pile, stretching it between his hands. It was even thinner than the eventual mana thread would be. It was made of mostly soft mana, with only traces of gray powder mixed. Consequently, it was extremely flexible but not very strong. It was meant to serve as the core of the mana threads, giving them their shape. He tentatively referred to this variant as the guide. Next, he willed some mana from the second pile to float toward the guide. At first glance, the mana looked like a pinch of fine dust. If one was to examine it more closely, they would notice that the individual grains sported a rather peculiar shape. Each one curved twice, making it look like a pair of hooks fused together at their base, their tips pointing in opposite directions. Unlike the guide, these grains contained a much higher percentage of gray powder and very little soft mana. It made them extremely hard, at the cost of having no flexibility whatsoever. Percy couldn't make them any larger without compromising their strength either. Not that he would want to do that, as it would just make the final threads thicker than they had to be. He called them the hooks. Willing the hooks to swirl around the guide for a few seconds, he waited until over half of the tiny constructs had latched onto the thin thread. The remaining ones he rotated by a right angle before repeating the process. He didn't stop until most of the hooks were interlocked either with the guide or with one another. The result was a slightly thicker thread that was almost as flexible as before, but dozens of times stronger. Of course, Percy wasn't done yet. The current configuration was strong and flexible, but extremely unstable. If he were to shake the thread even a little, most of the hooks would fall off. He drew the third ingredient from the cloth. This time it was some kind of gray paste, unlike the version he had used years ago to mend his cores. Before inventing the Aurora Dew, this one didn't contain a single drop of water. Percy had spent a lot of time looking for a variant he could produce exclusively out of his own mana. One that would also have the right properties. It contained soft and crystallized mana in equal parts. Initially, the mixture took a solid form, but it was soft and brittle. Crushing it into powder, Percy ended up with something similar to the dust he brewed into his Aurora Dew, albeit far stickier. He had named it the glue. The purpose of the glue was to hold the hooks in place so that they wouldn't fall off the guide, but he didn't rush to apply it to the thread just yet. First, he drew the fourth material from the cloth. It was a fine dust again, made mostly of hard mana. In fact, Percy had used the same ratio for it that he used for the hooks. The only difference was in the shape of the individual particles. They resembled grains of rice, although they were 100 times smaller than that. Percy called it the stuffing. This time, let's go with 10% more stuffing than before. Mixing it with the glue, Percy finally applied it to the thread, letting it fill the gap between the hooks. While the glue was there to hold the structure together, the stuffing was added to make the thread even stronger. Happy with the spine of the mana thread, Percy then grabbed the fifth ingredient from the cloth. It was made of the same material as the guide, but it was two-dimensional, shaped like a thin sheet. He called this one the skin. Mixing more glue and stuffing, he coated one side of the skin with them, but he didn't stop there. Next, he grabbed the sixth and final ingredient from the cloth. This time it was a bunch of small, flat plates of mana that resembled scales. Percy called them the shields. They had actually been the trickiest of the 6 alloys to invent, because they had to be both hard and flexible. Everything else, the hooks and the guide, that formed the spine of the mana threads, as well as the glue, the stuffing, and the skin that were meant to hold it in place, was there to maximize the tensile strength of the construct. The purpose of the shields was different, however. One weakness that Percy had luckily foreseen was that an opponent could easily sever the threads by slashing at them laterally with a sharp spell. These scales had been designed precisely to prevent that by guarding the core of the thread from external attacks. The only problem was that the scales themselves couldn't simultaneously be both as strong as the hooks and as flexible as the guide. So Percy had spent a lot of time scrambling his brain to achieve the right compromise. Spreading the scales on the sheet, he allowed them to mix with the glue and the stuffing. Then, he placed the spine of the mana thread on one end, before tightly rolling the skin several times around it. The final product was a gray string a few times thicker than a human hair. Thankfully, it was still thin enough to be woven into a fabric, however. That was something that both Percy and his spectral trait had been very peculiar about, after all. Heaving out a tired breath, Percy then examined the fruit of his labor. Tugging at both ends once again, he gradually increased the force he exerted on it, mentally comparing its strength to his previous attempt, and the ones before it. Seeing the thread refuse to break even after surpassing his previous best by a decent margin, he couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. At the same time, something deep inside him seemed to wake from its slumber. It was the remnants of the first spectral fiend he had absorbed, scattered throughout his very being. Noticing his achievement, his soul trembled with glee. The part of it inside his hands bubbled up and squirmed, extending outside his skin. It formed countless tiny legs that flailed in all sorts of unnatural directions. Updates are released by NovelCircledBulletFire.net. Guided by instinct, Percy couldn't help but trace his fingers over the gray thread, allowing the spider-like limbs to brush against the construct, sending waves of contentment rippling through him one after another. This was it. He could tell he wouldn't have to test another configuration anytime soon. His trait finally approving of the material pinched between his fingers. Congratulations! Your spell has evolved. Reinforcement, refined-spectral art. Phantom spun silk. Masterful. Percy's heart skipped a beat upon reading the notification. Any new spell was cause for celebration, even the crude ones. Due to the way Phoebe's decree worked, registering anything in his status meant that it was sufficiently different from his other spells to open up new doors for him. Even if the spell in question wasn't that powerful at first, it could always be upgraded or merged with others in the future. It was especially so for a masterful one, the highest tier Percy had heard of. And it was a spectral art at that. Obviously, it wasn't the first masterful spell he registered, not even close. But it was the first one he'd ever worked on, making this a satisfying little conclusion to his restless efforts over the years. It's such a pity that I can't use it yet. ssnovelcircledbulletfire.net. He sighed. It wasn't just due to his lacking Magiscript knowledge. There was another problem currently preventing him from weaving anything worthwhile out of the bluish-gray thread pinched between his fingers. While the construct was just as strong and flexible as he'd intended, stronger. Really, he didn't have much of it. Only a single, tiny piece. It was shorter than his finger, and he would need hundreds of meters of it before he could craft himself a new set of armor. Though, I suppose it makes more sense to call them clothes at that point. In any case, this wasn't just a question of time and effort. Sure, if Percy put his mind to it, he could prepare more strings over the next few months, slowly accumulating enough for his purposes. However, joining lots of small pieces would be the quickest way to compromise the structural integrity of the material. Unlike the powder he used in his alchemy, or the magical alloys he fashioned his weapons and tools out of, the threads needed to be continuous to fully exhibit their strength. Anything short of that would just waste all his previous efforts. Unfortunately, that came with its own set of problems. Percy understood that he couldn't cheat his way to a limitless supply of threads using something like his old Spirit-forged effigy spell. The controlled self-repair enchantment could only replicate something he'd already crafted. Couldn't extend it. If he were to tear a piece off the thread, he would be able to regrow it, but that would only get him 2 separate strings, not a single longer one. The issue was that he couldn't just weave a kilometer-long piece of thread in one sitting. He simply lacked the mental capacity to manipulate such a colossal volume of ingredients with the necessary precision. Luckily, not all hope was lost. Percy had foreseen this problem, and he'd taken some countermeasures to deal with it while designing the mana thread. While he couldn't possibly spin the entire length at once, he could slowly extend one end, growing some of the materials and adding others as he rolled them together. 4 of the 6 variants of fused mana he used didn't even have to be continuous. Namely, the hooks, the glue, the stuffing, and the shields were already made in lots of tiny pieces, so he could just keep adding more as he went. The only 2 variants that had to be uniform were the guide and the skin. That was why he'd specifically made them as simple as possible so that he could keep growing more of them. The strength of the threads wasn't even dependent on these 2 components, since their only purpose was to give everything else the right shape. Thus, even if his efforts resulted in a few imperfections here and there, it wouldn't compromise the material at all. Of course, it would still be mentally intensive and time-consuming. Even the tiny piece he'd already spun had taken him several minutes, and that was without accounting for the time he'd spent preparing the 6 piles of fused mana beforehand. This story originates from a different website. Ensure the author gets the support they deserve by reading it there. At my current speed, it would take me over a year of non-stop crafting to get enough. Percy shuddered at the thought. Leaving aside how monotonous it would be, this was time that he simply couldn't afford to waste. Worse still, the threads wouldn't even survive that long. None of his reinforced mana variants would last without preservation or self-repair runes. The problem was that he couldn't even weave the threads into runes until he was done, or it would mess with his crafting. This meant that he had to complete the whole thing as quickly as possible. He couldn't afford to waste more than a week or 2 on it, or his silk would start degrading. It's fine. I'll just have to get, 50 times better at it. No big deal. Percy was only half joking. He really was confident that he would improve a lot very quickly. Merely by virtue of having registered the spell, his eyes would be better at perceiving the minuscule components of the structure, allowing him to work on it much faster. His trait would help him too, now that he had a satisfactory material for it to play with. Beyond that, it was just a question of practice and repetition. I'm sure I'll be ready by the time Nesha and the clone are done with the runes. The biggest challenge would be balancing his time between this, training with Mickey, and brewing the rest of his elixirs into Aurora Dew. He also had to absorb another fiend at some point, continue sending his clones out, return the ring to Seoul, keep evading or fighting against the people looking for him, and prepare for the infiltration mission. He shrugged. Yeah, I think I'll take the rest of the day off. I can worry about all that tomorrow. All his excitement over the new spell had almost made him forget about his familiar and clone. The two were still sharing his mind, though they'd mercifully stopped chatting at some point, sparing him some of the disturbance. Congratulations on the new spell, Mickey said upon noticing his attention. Thanks. I see you haven't been slacking either. While the two tended to turn everything into a competition, it didn't mean they were playing around. They hadn't received a notification, because they didn't get those in the first place, but they'd still made a ton of progress over the past couple of days. Mickey was a lot better at using regulation with all 4 of his mutations. By now, he'd recovered his lost stamina already, and he'd even discovered something new. Given how much beast mana he was producing at the moment, he could keep all 4 instances of circulation active, even while idle. Gone were the days when he and the clone had to conserve part of their strength to keep their hunger at bay. Suspecting that Mickey's boosting art had crossed the upgrade threshold, Percy quickly opened his familiar status, soon confirming his guess. Congratulations, guys! Your spells have merged. Circulation, refined plus wild art. Regulation, refined - wild art. Consumption masterful. Percy felt 2 waves of pride and contentment rush through the chords. He didn't blame them for getting excited either. This was indeed massive. After all, it was Mickey's very first masterful spell. As a branched evolution of circulation, Percy couldn't help but compare it to his old synchronization spell. He wasn't surprised that Mickey's version had been given a higher classification. However, the spell was fundamentally different and far more complex. The reason the Crow hadn't been able to register synchronization himself was partly because of the mismatch between his core's grades, and partly because he couldn't absorb ambient mana with his first core to overcharge his channels. That meant that a significant fraction of the boost had always been capped by the strength already lingering inside Mickey's flesh, preventing him from tapping into the virtuous feedback loop that Percy and Nesha enjoyed. The addition of regulation, the mutations, and the extra sets of channels had changed that. Right now, Mickey had reached a new balance, different from his companions. He produced a lot of extra beast mana on the fly, finally allowing him to push his body past his previous limits. Reaching this point had taken him a long time, but the results spoke for themselves. Once you learn the dance too, you should be able to get yourself a top-tier masterful spell on par with the carnival. Mickey was about to say something in response, yet the words died inside his mind. A wave of alertness rippled through everyone's souls the very next second. Noticing that something was wrong, Percy allowed his senses to blend with his familiars, soon catching sight of the reason behind the bird's unease. On the slope beneath the Crow, there was a trail of footprints leading up the mountain. It had to be recent, barely a couple minutes old, or the raging blizzard would have erased it already. And it was heading straight toward Percy.